He slammed the contract onto the table so hard the ink jar rattled. "Sign it," Gerald Harper said, "or I'll have you declared incompetent and take everything your dead parents left you anyway." Abigail was 17 years old. She had nowhere to go, no one to call, and 9 years of evidence that her uncle meant every word he said. She didn't sign. 6 months later, on the morning of her 18th birthday, Gerald Harper dragged her suitcase to the front porch himself, dropped it in the mud, and locked the door behind her. The farmland stayed. The girl left. What happened next, no one in Millhaven, Ohio expected, least of all Abigail herself. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss what comes next. We tell stories that stay with you long after the last word. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where it really started. The advertisement was folded into thirds and tucked between the back pages of a church bulletin someone had left on the bench at the Millhaven post office. Abigail hadn't been looking for it. She'd gone to the post office to mail a letter to her mother's old attorney, a long shot she'd been composing and discarding for 3 weeks, never quite finding the words that didn't sound desperate. She found the bulletin on the bench because she needed to sit down. Her boots were soaked through from the walk across town in February sleet, and she had 42 cents in her coat pocket and no plan for where she'd sleep that night. Gerald had changed the locks on a Monday. By Wednesday, she'd exhausted every alternative she'd believed she had. The advertisement was small. Smaller than she expected for something that was, in every practical sense, a proposal. It read, "Rancher, 35, Wyoming Territory, seeks a woman of honest character and practical disposition. No wealth offered, no false promises made. Hard work guaranteed. If you are willing to try, write to Silas Boone, Cutters Creek, Wyoming." She read it twice, then a third time. What struck her, what made her fold it carefully and press it into her coat pocket instead of leaving it on the bench, was what it didn't say. It didn't say beautiful. It didn't say young or obedient or willing to relocate immediately. It didn't say must be agreeable or must have no encumbrances, the way some of those advertisements did. The ones that essentially described a woman the way a man might describe a horse he was hoping to buy cheap. It said honest character. It said practical disposition. It said if you are willing to try. Abigail Harper sat on that post office bench with sleet ticking against the window glass and 42 cents in her pocket and thought, I have been willing to try my entire life. I just haven't had anyone willing to try alongside me. She wrote the letter that afternoon, borrowing paper and an envelope from the postmistress, Mrs. Olin, who pretended not to notice the way Abigail's hand shook while she wrote. She kept it short. She said she was 18, recently on her own, capable of hard work, and familiar with farm operations. She said she had no money but no debts. She said she understood if he was looking for someone older, more experienced, more settled, but that she was none of those things and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She signed it. Abigail Harper. Willing to try. Then she slid it across the counter and watched Mrs. Olin weigh it and stamp it, and for a moment she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She had no idea what to call it. Not hope exactly. Something smaller than hope. The possibility of hope, maybe. A door she hadn't noticed before cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of light. His response came in 11 days. She'd been staying with Mrs. Olin by then, sleeping on a cot in the back room of the post office in exchange for sweeping the floors each morning and helping sort mail in the afternoons. It was not comfortable. Mrs. Olin was not a warm woman. But she was fair, and she didn't ask questions, and she had not once mentioned Gerald Harper or the farmland or any of the rumors that had likely already started moving through Millhaven like smoke under a door. Abigail recognized the Wyoming postmark before she'd even finished reading the front of the envelope. She took it to the back room and sat on the cot and opened it with her thumbnail. His handwriting was not elegant. It was a working man's script. Square letters, some of them unevenly spaced, like a man who'd learned to write but hadn't made a habit of it. There were no flourishes, no poetry. He'd crossed out one word near the top and replaced it, which she found oddly reassuring. Men who never crossed anything out were either very certain or not thinking hard enough. He wrote that he'd received several letters in response to the advertisement, but that hers was the one he'd read twice. He said he couldn't explain why exactly. He wasn't good at explaining things like that, but that something in the way she'd written struck him as straightforward. He said straightforward was the quality he valued most and found least often. He told her about the ranch, 120 acres near Cutter's Creek cattle operation. One hired hand who came 3 days a week. He said the winters were serious and that he wouldn't soften that. He said the nearest town was 11 miles out. Then he wrote a paragraph that Abigail would read so many times in the weeks that followed, she nearly memorized it by accident. I won't pretend I know what kind of arrangement this would be. I don't think a person can know that until they're standing in it. What I can tell you is that I'd treat you fairly. You'd have your own room. You'd have a say in how things run. And if you arrived and decided it wasn't what you wanted, I'd put you on the next train home myself. No argument. I'm not looking to trap anyone. I've been trapped before, and I wouldn't do it to another person. She folded the letter and held it in both hands for a long time. Then she wrote back and said yes. Mrs. Oland drove her to the station in a borrowed cart on a gray Tuesday morning in early March. She handed Abigail a paper bag with 2 boiled eggs and a corn muffin inside, and she said, without looking at her, "You write when you get there." "I will," Abigail said. "Don't tell me it's fine if it isn't." Abigail looked at the old woman. Mrs. Oland was studying the horse's ears with intense concentration. "I won't," Abigail said. The train ride was 3 days. She had a ticket Silas had sent with his last letter and a window seat and the paper bag from Mrs. Oland and very little else. She watched Ohio flatten into Indiana, Indiana open into Illinois, the Mississippi sliding beneath the bridge in a brown February rush, then Missouri, then Kansas, then the high plains beginning to lift and spread under a sky that got bigger every hour. She'd never been anywhere. She'd never been more than 30 miles from Millhaven in her entire life. The farmland her parents had left her was 5 miles from the house where she'd been born, and even that felt, some days, like the outer edge of the world she knew. Now the world she knew was somewhere behind her. The world ahead was made of strangers and open space, and a man she'd never met who crossed out words when he was thinking hard and said he wouldn't trap anyone because he'd been trapped himself. She didn't sleep well on the train. She kept waking in the night with her heart going too fast, convinced she was making the worst mistake of her life, then lying there in the dark car listening to the wheels on the track until her heart slowed again. She had no way to verify anything he'd told her. She had no way to know if the ranch was real, if he was who he said he was, if the photograph he'd sent, a weathered man squinting slightly against western light, holding a fence post like he'd just been working and stopped to be photographed, matched the actual person. She had his letters, she had her own judgment, she had no other options she was willing to take. On the second night, somewhere in the middle of Kansas, a woman across the aisle noticed Abigail staring at the dark window and leaned over. "You all right, honey?" Abigail turned. The woman was perhaps 50, heavy-set with a practical face and kind eyes. She had a knitting project in her lap that she'd apparently been working at by the light of the small overhead lamp. "I'm fine," Abigail said. The woman studied her for a moment. "Where are you headed?" "Wyoming Territory, Cutter's Creek." "Somebody waiting for you there?" A pause. "I think so." The woman considered this. "You think so," she repeated, not unkindly. "Well, that's more than a lot of people have." She went back to her knitting. Abigail went back to the dark window. But something about the exchange, the matter-of-factness of it, the woman's complete absence of alarm, steadied her a little. That's more than a lot of people have. It wasn't exactly encouragement. It was something closer to honesty, and honesty was what Abigail had been surviving on for the better part of her life. She arrived at the Cutter's Creek station on a Thursday afternoon in a thin, brittle sunlight that made everything look more exposed than she was ready for. The station was small. A platform, a wooden building, a water tower. There were 4 other people on the platform. A family with luggage. A station agent talking to a man in a canvas coat. And standing slightly apart from all of them, a tall man in a brown hat who was turning the brim of that hat slowly in both hands. He wasn't looking at the train. He was looking at his boots. She understood, watching him from the top of the train steps, that he was nervous. It was the most reassuring thing she'd seen in 3 days. She came down the steps with her suitcase and walked toward him, and when she was 10 feet away, he looked up and they regarded each other for a moment, 2 strangers who had agreed in writing to try. "Miss Harper," he said. "Mr. Boone." He was taller than the photograph suggested. His face was weathered in the way of a man who worked outside, with deep lines around his eyes, and those eyes were a light gray that she hadn't expected. He looked like what he'd said he was. She noted this. He looked exactly like what he'd said he was. "Train ride all right?" he asked. "Long," she said. "Yeah." He shifted his weight. "I've got a wagon. Your bag..." He reached for her suitcase and she let him take it, which cost her something because she had been carrying her own things alone for a long time. But she let him. They walked to the wagon without speaking. He put the suitcase in the back. He helped her up to the seat with one hand and then walked around and climbed up on his side and gathered the reins and sat there for a moment without moving. "I want to say something before we go," he said. She waited. "I said in my letter you could leave if it wasn't what you wanted." He was looking at the space between the horse's ears. "I meant it. If you get out there and it isn't right, for any reason, doesn't have to be a big reason. You tell me and I'll bring you back to the station myself. No argument, no hard feelings. You're not trapped." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. She was 18 years old. She had grown up in a house where every offer came with a hidden cost. She had learned before she was 10 years old that when a man said, "I'm doing this for your own good," he meant, "This is for my benefit and I'd like your cooperation." She had learned that promises were levers and kindness was currency, and that the most dangerous words in the English language were usually the ones that sounded the most reasonable. But she looked at this man's profile. The jaw set, the lines around his eyes, the hands holding the reins with the same steadiness he'd probably used to hold 1,000 things that needed holding. And she thought, he means it. She couldn't explain it. She had no evidence beyond the letters and his face and the way he'd been turning his hat in his hands before she walked up. But she thought, he means it. "All right," she said. He nodded once and clicked to the horse, and they moved. The road out to the ranch was 11 miles of open country, most of it unpaved, and Silas Boone did not try to fill it with talking. This was unexpected. Every man Abigail had ever been forced to deal with had used words the way Gerald used them, to manage, to redirect, to ensure she understood things his way. The silence in the wagon was different. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't the silence of a man who was ignoring her. It was simply the silence of a man who didn't feel the need to perform anything. She found herself noticing things, the way the light moved on the grass, the size of the sky. She hadn't been prepared for the sky, for how much of it there was, how it didn't end in tree lines or rooftops, but just kept going until she felt slightly dizzy looking at it. The smell of the air, which was cold and clean and different from anything she'd grown up with. "What happened to the previous Mrs. Boone?" she asked. It came out more directly than she'd intended. She felt him shift slightly on the seat. "There wasn't one," he said. "Oh. I was engaged once, 12 years ago. She changed her mind." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't say that to make you feel sorry for me. I just didn't want you to have a wrong idea about what you were stepping into." "I appreciate that." More silence. The horse picked its way along the rutted track. "What happened with your uncle?" he asked. She told him in the letters the bare outline, the farmland her parents left, the 9 years with Gerald, the way the situation had finally resolved itself. "He wanted the land," she said. "He thought if he waited long enough or made things hard enough, I'd give it to him." "Did you ever consider it?" "Giving it to him?" "Yeah." She thought about it honestly. "There were nights when I thought about it, when it seemed like it would just be easier. But my mother planted the apple trees herself. She chose every one of them." She paused. "I couldn't." Silas was quiet then. "No, I don't think you could." There was something in the way he said it, not sentimental, not performing understanding. Just matter of fact, like a man acknowledging a thing that was simply true. It landed somewhere in her chest and stayed there. The ranch was not what she'd imagined. She'd imagined something rustic but functional. What she found was rustic and about half functional, held together in places with wire and optimism and what appeared to be considerable physical effort on someone's part. The main house was solid enough. Log construction, a good roof, 2 rooms downstairs, and the loft above. But the barn had a section of fencing that had been repaired so many times it was more patched than original. The supply shed had a door that hung at an angle. The yard between the buildings needed attention. She stood in the middle of it while Silas carried her suitcase inside and took it all in. It was real. It wasn't clean or settled or easy. It was a working ranch that was stretched in every direction and hadn't had 2 people managing it for a long time. She felt something she didn't expect. Relief. She didn't want easy. She'd survived 9 years of Gerald Harper's version of easy, which was to say she'd survived 9 years of being managed in someone else's interest. She wanted real. She wanted work that was hers and results that meant something. She went inside. He'd set her suitcase inside the door of the second downstairs room, a small room with a bed and a chest of drawers and a hook on the wall for coats. It was not comfortable or elegant. The window looked out onto the side yard and had a curtain that someone had made from flour sacking. It was her room, not a borrowed cot in a post office, not a corner of someone else's space. Her room. She pressed her hand against the doorframe and did not allow herself to cry, which was harder than it sounds. The first week was a sequence of miscalculations. She had told him she was familiar with farm operations, which was true, but Ohio farm operations and Wyoming ranch operations overlapped about as much as she'd expected, which was to say not very much. The cattle were different. The scale, the distances, the way they needed to be managed across open country rather than in enclosed pasture. The weather came in differently here, fast and sideways with no warning. On the third day, she tried to help repair a section of the east fence and drove a nail through her thumb. She stood there for a moment with her thumb pinched between her fingers while blood welled up between the knuckles and thought very hard about what she would not say out loud. Silas appeared at her elbow with a rag. "I know," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything. I could tell you were thinking it." He handed her the rag. "I was thinking you hit it at a bad angle. The wood's hardened." "I hit it at a bad angle because I was wrong about the wood," she said flatly. He looked at her. "You want to try again or take a break?" She wrapped the rag around her thumb, which was throbbing impressively. "Show me the right angle." He showed her. She went back to the fence. He didn't praise her for it. He didn't say "good girl" or "there you go" or any of the small, condescending celebrations she'd been on the receiving end of her entire life whenever she'd managed to do something that a man thought was beyond her. He just moved down the fence line to the next post and kept working. She realized somewhere around the fourth nail that she was grateful for that. More grateful than she could have articulated. Mercer showed up on a Saturday. She learned later that this was intentional, that Calvin Mercer, whose cattle operation covered the biggest spread in the Cutters Creek Valley, always rode out on Saturdays, when he figured men were either tired from the week's work or softened up by it. He came with 2 ranch hands and a quality of ease that suggested he was accustomed to being accommodated. Abigail was hanging washing on the line when the 3 riders came into the yard. She stopped what she was doing and watched them. Mercer was perhaps 50, heavy-set, with good clothes and a hat that cost more than anything else visible in the yard. He dismounted at the fence and opened the gate without being invited, which told her a great deal. Silas came out of the barn. "Calvin," he said. Not warm, not hostile, flat. "Silas." Mercer looked around the yard with the particular expression of a man calculating. His gaze passed over Abigail and moved on, which also told her something. "Heard you had company." "My wife," Silas said. The word landed in the yard between them. Abigail noted that Silas had said it without hesitation, without the slight hedge or apology some men put into my wife when the situation was complicated. He said it like a fact. Mercer smiled. "Well, congratulations are in order." "What can I do for you, Calvin?" Mercer tilted his head toward the east. "Thinking about the creek." "The creek isn't available." "I'm not talking about buying it, just an arrangement. Seasonal access for my herd. I'd compensate you fairly." "The creek keeps my herd alive through July and August," Silas said. "If I give seasonal access to 800 head on top of mine, it won't." "My people have surveyed the water table. There's plenty." "Your people don't run cattle on my land." Mercer's smile stayed, but something in his eyes changed. He looked at Abigail again, and this time he didn't look away. "New wife might appreciate some extra income," he said. "Young woman, managing a spread like this." Abigail set down the shirt she was holding and walked toward the fence. She didn't run it through her head first. She just walked. "Mr. Mercer," she said. He looked at her with mild surprise, as if a piece of furniture had spoken. "My husband said no," she said. He said it clearly, and he said it for reasons that make sense. "If you'd like to discuss the water table survey, I'd be glad to look at it with you and tell you what I think is missing from the analysis. Otherwise, we have a full day's work ahead of us." Mercer looked at her for a moment, then he looked at Silas. Silas said nothing. He just waited. Mercer clicked his tongue softly. "I'll be in touch," he said, and remounted. They watched him ride out. When the sound of the horses faded, Silas turned to look at her. She picked up the shirt from where she'd dropped it and went back to the washing line. "Thank you," he said behind her. "You'd have said the same things," she said. "I'd have said fewer of them." She thought about that. "Maybe, but sometimes more words are more useful." She heard him make a small sound that might, if she was being charitable, have been a laugh. She didn't turn around to check. The letter from Gerald arrived on a Thursday in late April. She knew the handwriting before she'd finished pulling it from the envelope. Knew it the way you know the sound of a particular door in a house. The specific wrongness of it, the way it made something in her stomach tighten before her brain had finished processing. He'd found out where she was. She didn't know how. It hadn't occurred to her that he would look. She sat at the kitchen table and read it twice. He claimed, in the careful language of a man who'd consulted someone vaguely legal, that because she had left the state without proper documentation of the farmland's ownership arrangements, certain questions had arisen that required resolution. He said he was prepared to contest her parents' will on the grounds of her age at the time of their death and her subsequent failure to maintain the property. He said that if she wished to avoid this, a financial settlement could be discussed. He wasn't asking for the land anymore. He was asking for money. He'd gotten smarter, or he'd gotten desperate, or both. She set the letter on the table and pressed her hands flat against the wood and sat there for a long time. Silas came in from the yard at noon for water and found her like that. He looked at her, he looked at the letter, he crossed the room and picked it up without asking and read it. She watched his face while he read. It didn't show much. He got to the end and set it back on the table and pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Is any of it valid?" he asked. "The legal argument?" "Yeah." She had been thinking about this for the better part of 3 hours. Parts of it. He'd have to prove the will was improperly executed, which I don't think it was. But it would take time to fight it, and money, and... She stopped. "And he knows that." "He's hoping you'll pay him to go away." "Yes." Silas looked at the letter again. "What do you want to do?" She blinked. In 9 years of being told what to do about everything from how to set a table to whether she was allowed to go into town alone, the question, "What do you want to do?" was so foreign it took her a moment to understand it was genuine. "I want to fight it," she said. "I don't want to give him a single dollar." Silas nodded. "Then we'll fight it." He stood up. "I'll ask around about attorneys. There's a man in Ridgeline who handles property disputes. I've heard he's honest. That costs money we don't have. We'll find it." He said it without drama, not bravely or recklessly, just as a fact, the way he said most things. "You didn't come all the way to Wyoming to give your uncle what he wants." She looked up at him. "No," she said. "I didn't." He picked up his water and went back outside. She sat at the table for another minute. Then she folded Gerald's letter carefully, pressed it flat, and put it in the drawer where she kept her mother's letters. Evidence, she thought. Everything is evidence, if you keep it long enough. April turned to May. The ranch didn't slow down for emotional distress, which Abigail found more useful than she would have expected. There was always something that needed doing. The cattle needed moving. The fencing needed checking after a spring storm came through and took down 2 sections on the north slope. The supplies needed reorganizing. She discovered in her first weeks that Silas's system for tracking what they had and what they needed was essentially not a system at all, but a series of mental notes and handwritten scraps that he'd been carrying around in his head for years. She started a ledger. He didn't comment on it at first, and then one evening he stood at her shoulder for a while reading back through the entries. "You've been doing this since your 3rd week," he said. "Since my 2nd week," she corrected. "I was observing in the 1st week." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been overpaying for feed." "By about 15%. There's a supplier in Ridgeline who would give you a better price, especially if you commit to a quarterly order." He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I asked around when you took me to town last month, while you were at the hardware." Another pause. He set the ledger back on the table. "You were asking about feed prices while I was buying nails." "I was also looking at the cost of lumber, since the east fence is going to need more than patching eventually." She kept her voice even. "I wasn't trying to take over anything. She stopped, started again. "I notice things. It's hard to turn off." "I didn't say it bothered me," he said. She looked at him. "I said it surprised me," he said. "Those aren't the same thing." She turned back to the ledger. He went back to whatever he'd been doing. But she noticed in the days that followed that he started telling her more about the decisions he was weighing, about what he'd heard from the other ranchers in the valley, about what the season looked like and what he was worried about. Not performing confidence, not pretending everything was fine, just talking to her like a person who was part of the operation and had a right to know what was actually happening. She hadn't known a man could do that. She didn't say so. But she thought it, standing at the window one morning, watching him work the east fence line with the hired hand, and the thought sat in her chest like something warm she didn't have a word for yet. The second time Mercer came, he came alone. It was a weekday, mid-morning, when Silas was out on the range and Abigail was at the supply shed taking inventory. She heard a rider and looked up, and there was Mercer at the gate watching her. She kept her hand steady and walked over. "Mr. Mercer." "Mrs. Boone." He tipped his hat, which she noticed. Men who wanted something usually remembered their manners. Your husband around? He's working. Of course he is. He looked out at the range with an expression she was beginning to read. Calculation dressed as appreciation. Hard-working man, Silas. Always has been. Never could see past the next season, though. That's his limitation. She said nothing. A man with real vision, Mercer continued, looks at a water source like Cutter's Creek and sees what it could be worth over 20 years, not what it costs to protect this year. A man with real vision, Abigail said, also understands that the rancher who controls the creek controls the valley and that some things aren't worth selling at any price. Mercer looked at her with something she couldn't quite categorize. Not quite respect, something adjacent to it. Your husband is a lucky man, he said. He's a capable man, she said. Those aren't the same thing either. She watched him ride away and then stood there in the cold morning air and waited until her hands stopped shaking before she went back to the inventory. She'd talk to Silas tonight. She'd tell him Mercer had come, what had been said, what she'd read in the space between his words. Because that was how they operated now, she and Silas Boone. They told each other the truth. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a policy they'd discussed or a rule they'd agreed to, it was just what they did. She picked up her inventory list and got back to work. Outside, the Wyoming sky was enormous and indifferent, and she realized, no longer afraid of it. Somewhere between Ohio and here, between the post office bench and the first nail through her thumb and the letter in the drawer and the ledger on the kitchen table, she had stopped waiting to be sent away and started, in some quiet, unannounced way, to belong. She wasn't done being careful. She wasn't done being watchful. Gerald's letter was still in the drawer and Mercer was still on the road and the east fence wasn't getting cheaper. But she was here. She was not trapped. She had chosen this and it had chosen her back in its hard, cold, imperfect Wyoming way. She wrote a number in the ledger column and moved to the next item on the list. The attorney's name was Edmund Voss, and he operated out of a narrow office above the Ridgeline feed store that smelled permanently of grain dust and old paper. He was perhaps 60, with the kind of face that had stopped being impressed by things decades ago, and he read Gerald Harper's letter with the same expression a man might use to read a grocery list. It's not nothing, he said, setting it on his desk. I know it's not nothing, Abigail said. That's why we're here. Voss looked at her over the top of his glasses, then at Silas, then back at her. She got the sense he was recalibrating something. The will itself. Do you have a copy? I have the original. My mother kept it in the Bible she left me. I brought it. She produced it from her coat, folded inside an oilcloth sleeve she'd made for it the week before. Voss took it and unfolded it carefully and read it with more attention than he'd given Gerald's letter. The office was quiet except for the sound of wagons on the street below and the occasional thump from the feed store. This is properly executed, Voss said finally. I know. Your uncle would have to demonstrate it wasn't. That's a significant burden. He's claiming I abandoned the property by leaving Ohio. Voss set the document down. Did you arrange for it to be managed while you were gone? She had. 2 weeks before she'd left Millhaven, she'd spoken to a neighbor named Pete Garner who farmed the adjacent land, and they'd made a verbal agreement about oversight. She had a letter confirming it. Pete had written it at her request, which at the time she'd thought was just being careful and now understood was the most important thing she'd done. She produced that too. Voss read it. Something in his expression shifted slightly. Not warmly, but professionally. The way a man looks when a case becomes more interesting. You came prepared. I came afraid, Abigail said. Prepared was the only thing I could control. Silas, who had been sitting quietly in the chair beside her, said nothing, but she felt him look at her. Voss set Pete Garner's letter next to the will. I'll write to the court in Millhaven. Your uncle has filed a preliminary inquiry, not a formal claim. He's testing to see if you'll respond. If you respond through proper legal channels, it signals that you're not going to be managed. He paused. Men like your uncle tend to prefer targets who don't fight back. He's never known me to fight back, Abigail said. He's about to learn something new. Voss almost smiled. My fee is $12 for the initial correspondence and assessment. If it goes further, we discuss further. She looked at Silas. He nodded once. Then we proceed, she said. They rode home from Ridgeline in the early afternoon, the wagon moving at its usual unhurried pace, the sky clear and enormous above the open country. She'd been holding herself tight all morning, the way she'd learned to hold herself in Gerald's house, braced for the thing that hadn't happened yet. Now the meeting was done, and the will was back in her coat pocket, and she let herself exhale slowly, carefully, like releasing pressure from something that had been sealed too long. You had that letter from Pete Garner the whole time, Silas said, since before I left Ohio. You didn't mention it. I didn't know if I'd need it. She watched the road ahead. I've been keeping things like that for years. Documents, letters, anything that could be evidence. It was a habit I developed when I was about 13 and realized Gerald was going to be a problem that didn't go away. Silas was quiet for a stretch. The horse moved steadily. 13, he said. I was a practical child. You were a scared child who made herself practical, he said. Not unkindly, just accurately. She looked at him. He was watching the road. Yes, she said. That's right. Neither of them said anything else for a while. The wagon rolled on through the open country, and the silence between them was, as it had increasingly become, the comfortable kind. Not absence, but presence. Two people who didn't feel the need to fill every moment with noise. She was beginning to understand that this was rare. She hadn't known it was rare until she had it. May turned into something harder. 2 weeks after the visit to Voss, a cold snap came down from the north without much warning and hit the high pasture where Silas had moved 20 head of cattle for the spring grass. He was out before dawn to check on them and didn't come back until late morning. And when he did, his face had the particular closed quality she'd come to recognize as the expression he wore when something had gone wrong that he hadn't yet decided how to talk about. How bad? She asked. He sat down at the table and didn't take his coat off. Lost 2. 3 more are going to need watching. She'd already put coffee on. She set a cup in front of him and sat across from him and waited. I should have moved them back down 2 days ago, he said. I saw the signs. I thought I had more time. Sometimes you don't have more time. I should have moved them anyway. She understood what he was doing. She'd done it herself enough times. The meticulous reconstruction of the moment you could have chosen differently, as if understanding it precisely enough would somehow change it. It didn't change anything, but it felt necessary in the same way pressing a bruise feels necessary. What do you need to do today? She asked. He looked up. For the 3 that are still alive, she said. What do they need? He came back to himself. She could see it happen, the shift from the self-recriminating place back to the operational one. They need to come down to the lower pasture. Warmth, watching overnight. Then tell me what to do and we'll start. He told her. It took most of the day, moving the cattle down the slope, getting them into the sheltered area near the barn, checking each one. Silas's hired hand, a taciturn man named Roy, who came 3 days a week and communicated mostly through grunts and decisive action, appeared at midday without being asked and worked alongside them until the job was done. By evening, they were in rough shape. Abigail's hands were stiff from the cold and her boots were soaked again, and there was a long scratch on her forearm from a fence she'd pushed through too fast. She sat at the kitchen table while Silas cleaned the scratch with the methodical attention of a man who had patched many things in his life and understood the value of not letting small damage become larger damage. You don't have to do that, she said. It'll get infected if you don't clean it right. I can clean it myself. I know you can. He kept working. Let me anyway. She let him. His hands were careful. He was looking at the scratch and not at her face, which made it easier to stay still. Roy didn't have to come today, she said. No. He just showed up. Roy's been here since before I bought the place. He came with it, basically. Worked for the previous owner for 12 years. Silas tied off the cloth he'd used to wrap the scratch. He doesn't say much, but he shows up. That's worth a lot, she said. Most things that are worth a lot don't advertise themselves. She thought about that for a moment. Then she looked at him, at the lines around his eyes, the rough hands, the set of his jaw. He was not what she'd imagined when she'd read that first advertisement. She hadn't known what to imagine, but he was not a comfortable man or an easy man, and he made no pretense of being either, and she was increasingly grateful for that. The cattle we lost, she said. Was that going to set us back significantly? He was quiet for a moment. Honest math, she'd come to understand, took him a beat or two. Some. Not catastrophically, but Mercer's going to hear about it. How? Mercer hears everything that happens in this valley within 48 hours. It's one of the ways he operates. He collects information and then figures out how to use it. Silas looked at her. He'll see it as pressure point. 2 head lost, a young wife who maybe isn't settled yet. He'll think we're closer to the edge than we are. Are we close to the edge? No, he said, but we need a good summer. She nodded. Then we have a good summer. He almost said something. She could see him not say it, the slight change in his jaw, the breath taken and redirected. What he did say was, "You're not what I expected." What did you expect? He considered this with more seriousness than she'd anticipated. Someone more frightened, he said finally. Someone who'd need more time. I'm frightened plenty, she said. I just don't have the luxury of letting it stop me." He looked at her for a moment and then looked away, and she saw something in his face that she'd started to recognize. A quality of careful attention that he deployed the way some men deployed confidence, as a form of armor and also as a form of connection. "Abigail," he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name. "I want you to know something." She waited. "Whatever happens with your uncle, with Mercer, it's not your problem alone. It's the ranch's problem, which means it's mine too." He picked up the cloth scraps and stood up. "I know you've been doing things alone for a long time. I'm not asking you to stop being capable. I'm just saying you don't have to do the carrying alone anymore." He took the cloth to the wash basin, and she sat at the table and looked at her wrapped forearm and thought, "He means it. He keeps meaning what he says, and it keeps catching me off guard." She didn't know what to do with a person like that. She'd been managing on her own for so long that being offered something reliable felt almost suspicious. Her instinct was to find the catch. Her instinct was to locate the moment where it curdled into something Gerald-shaped. But it didn't curdle. It stayed. The following Saturday, she went into Ridgeline without Silas. He had a full day with Roy on the fencing, and she had errands she could handle alone, supplies to pick up, a letter to mail to Voss confirming some additional details he'd requested, and one other piece of business she hadn't mentioned yet. She drove the wagon herself. This was not complicated. She'd driven wagons since she was 11, but she noticed the way Mrs. Aldford at the dry goods store looked at her when she came in alone, and the way two women she didn't know by name tracked her progress across the store with an interest that was not entirely friendly. She'd been aware of it since her first week. The Watchers. Cutter's Creek was small enough that a mail-order bride arriving from Ohio was the kind of thing people had opinions about before they knew the first fact about her. She'd caught fragments, the words young and alone and doesn't know what she's gotten into, which she found irritating rather than hurtful, mostly because she'd heard variations of it her entire life and had long since stopped letting other people's predictions define her schedule. She was at the counter at the dry goods store when a woman came to stand beside her, deliberately, the way people do when they want to talk, not coincidentally. "Mrs. Boone," the woman said. Abigail turned. She was perhaps 40, slim, with a watchful face and eyes that were doing a lot of work. "Yes." "Margaret Hale. My husband runs the farrier operation on the north end of town." She paused. "I heard you came from Ohio." "That's right. On the advertisement." Not a question. "Yes." Margaret Hale studied her with the frankness of a woman who'd decided to skip past the social preamble and get to the thing she wanted to say. "Silas Boone is a good man," she said. "I want you to know that, from someone who isn't him. He's had a hard several years, and he's carried it quietly, and he didn't deserve any of it." Abigail looked at her steadily. "I know he's a good man. Some women who come this way—" She stopped, started again. "Not every arrangement like this works out well. I've seen some go badly." "Mrs. Hale," Abigail said, "are you asking if I plan to stay?" The woman held her gaze. "I suppose I am." "Then yes," Abigail said. "I plan to stay." Margaret Hale nodded once, slowly, like something that had been uncertain had just been confirmed. "Then you'll need people," she said. "Nobody runs a ranch in this valley without community. The Boone place has been running without it for a while. That's part of why it's been hard." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying come to the spring social next Saturday. Bring your husband. Let people see that you're not going anywhere." She picked up the package she'd apparently already purchased from the counter. "And if you need anything, you can ask Tom or me. We're on the north end of town, the operation with the blue door." She left before Abigail had worked out how to respond to any of it. She stood at the counter with her list in her hand and thought, that was the most practical kindness I've been offered since Mrs. Olin's boiled eggs. She found she was smiling slightly in the direction Margaret Hale had gone, and she let herself do it. She told Silas about the conversation that evening. He was at the table doing the week's accounts, his original version, which she'd been gradually supplementing with the ledger. She sat across from him and gave him the full account, the way she gave him most things now. Accurately, without softening the edges or performing a reaction she didn't have. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Margaret Hale has lived in this valley her whole life," he said. "If she's vouching for you, people will listen." "She wasn't vouching for me. She was asking if I was going to be reliable." "Same thing, in practice." Abigail thought about this. "Do you want to go to the social?" He made a face that she had come to understand meant he would do a thing he found uncomfortable because the practical argument for it was solid. You think we should. I think Mercer would prefer we stayed isolated. Community is a resource, same as water rights or legal documents. He looked at her. You've been thinking about this for a while. Since the first time he came here. She folded her hands on the table. He's testing us. That's what all of it is. The creek proposal, the casual visits, whatever he said to the neighbors who look at us sideways. He's seeing what we're connected to and what we're not. The answer so far has been, not much. We've been busy. I know. I'm not criticizing. I'm thinking out loud. She paused. We should go to the social. All right, he said. He went back to the accounts. She looked at the side of his face for a moment. The jaw, the lines around his eyes, the slight furrow between his brows that appeared when he was doing math. How wasn't a complicated man in the way some people were complicated, which was to say he wasn't performing layers he didn't have. But there was depth to him, the kind that came from years of loss and work and carrying things quietly, and she'd been slowly mapping the contours of it the way you map territory that doesn't give itself up easily but rewards patience. Silas, she said. He looked up. Why did you put that advertisement in the paper? It was something she'd been holding for weeks. He told her about the engagement that ended 12 years ago. He told her about the hard years, but not the specific moment, not what had finally made a man who clearly valued privacy and independence put a notice in a paper asking a stranger to come live on his ranch. He set down the pencil. He considered the question with the same honest weight he gave most things. The winter before last, he said, I got sick. Nothing fatal. Fever mostly. Lasted a week. He looked at the table. Roy was here during the day, but at night there was nobody. I woke up in the middle of the night 3 nights in a row and the house was dark and I thought, he stopped. I thought, if this goes wrong, nobody will know for 2 days. That's a long time. She waited. It didn't go wrong, he said. I got better, but I kept thinking about it. He picked the pencil back up but didn't write anything. I'm 35 years old. I can run this ranch alone. I have been running it alone. But I looked at the next 20 years and I thought, I don't want to do this alone. Not because I can't, because I don't want to. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the Wyoming evening was doing what it did. The sky-going color she still wasn't used to, the cattle settling. That's a brave thing to admit, she said. It's just true. Brave things usually are. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not the way it happened in the stories she'd read as a child, where men became transformed by a single moment. More like a slow adjustment, like a door that had been stuck for a long time finally moving on its hinge. You didn't answer, he said. What? I answered your question. You said, why did you put the advertisement in? I answered. But I never asked you why you answered it, beyond the obvious. She understood what he was asking. Beyond the uncle, beyond the lack of options, beyond the 42 cents and the post office bench. The real question underneath. Because of the words you chose, she said. Honest character, practical disposition, willing to try. She looked at her hands. Every man who ever had any kind of power over me used words to make himself sound reasonable while doing unreasonable things. You used words to say what you actually meant. I didn't know how rare that was until I saw it. He was quiet for a moment. I almost didn't send it. The advertisement? The letter. My response to yours. I wrote it 3 times. The first 2 versions were, he seemed to search for the word, worse, more careful. I kept taking things out that I was afraid sounded too, he stopped. Too honest? She asked. Too much, he said. She thought about the crossed out word in his first letter. She thought about the paragraph she'd read so many times she'd nearly memorized it. I won't pretend I know what kind of arrangement this would be. The paragraph she suspected he'd almost taken out. I'm glad you left them in, she said. He nodded. He picked up his pencil and went back to the accounts. She went back to the ledger. But there was something in the room now that hadn't been there before. Not tension, not its opposite. Something more like acknowledgement. Like 2 people who had been carefully, methodically building something had taken a moment to look up and see that what they'd built was already holding weight. The spring social was held in the Ridgeline Town Hall on a Saturday evening. Lanterns strung across the ceiling, the smell of pine boards and coffee and something baked that she couldn't immediately identify. It was larger than she'd expected. Nearly the whole valley, it seemed, with children underfoot and older couples occupying the chairs along the walls, and a group of younger men near the door who looked at everything with the studied indifference of people who cared considerably more than they were admitting. Silas was uncomfortable. She could tell because he stood the way he stood in open country, straight, a little watchful, like a man tracking weather. He wasn't unfriendly. He just hadn't done this in a while. Margaret Hale found them within 10 minutes and performed the introductions with the efficient warmth of a woman who'd been doing it her whole life. The farrier husband, Tom, was large and quiet and shook Silas's hand with genuine pleasure. A couple named Brent and Della Moss ran cattle 3 miles east. An older woman named Ruth Calloway had the only millinery shop in the valley and apparently knew everything about everyone, which she communicated with a kind of benign enthusiasm that Abigail found both exhausting and oddly comforting. "You're the Ohio girl," Ruth said. "I am," Abigail said. "I heard you told Calvin Mercer off twice already." Abigail looked at her. "Word travels." "Like smoke," Ruth said, cheerfully. "Both times in your own yard, which people appreciate. He's been buying up access rights all over this valley for 3 years, and nobody's told him no with any real conviction until now." She tilted her head. "You're either very brave, or you don't know yet what you're dealing with." "A bit of both, probably." Ruth laughed. A real laugh, not a polite one. "I like you," she said, as if it surprised her. Abigail thought, "I like you too, actually." She said, "What do people know about his plans, specifically?" Ruth's expression changed slightly, more focused, the social warmth redirected into something sharper. "Sit with me a moment." What Ruth Calloway knew, delivered quietly over 2 cups of coffee in the corner while Silas talked cattle with Tom Hale and Brent Moss, was this. Calvin Mercer had spent the last 3 years systematically acquiring water access rights from smaller ranches in the valley. Not buying the land, just the water access. It looked like a business arrangement, reasonable even, until you understood that the ranches that had sold access rights were now paying Mercer for usage of their own creeks during dry season, because his acquisition had restructured the water table in ways that affected their wells. "It's not illegal," Ruth said. "He's been careful about that." "It's a squeeze play," Abigail said. "A slow one. He doesn't rush." Ruth looked at her steadily. Cutter's Creek is the last significant water source in the valley he doesn't control some form of access to. Your ranch sits right on top of it. How long has he been watching it? Before Silas bought the place. The previous owner sold out, actually. Mercer made an offer. But the price wasn't right, and the owner sold to Silas instead, and Mercer's been patient since then. She paused. He'll get less patient. Abigail held her coffee cup in both hands and looked across the room at Silas, who was talking with Tom and Brent with the slightly loosened quality of a man who'd stopped tracking exits. He was listening to something Brent was saying with genuine attention. She could see, from here, the moment he laughed. Brief, real, a thing he didn't perform. She thought, he doesn't do this enough. He has people here who like him, and he's been too inside his own walls to know it. She thought, we've both been too inside our own walls. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "what you've told me, would other ranchers in the valley be willing to share what they know? Documented?" Ruth looked at her with open interest. "About Mercer's acquisitions?" "About the pattern. The way the water access has worked, what they signed, and what happened afterward." She kept her voice level. "Not to cause trouble, to understand what we're protecting and how." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're not just protecting a ranch, are you?" "I don't know yet what I'm doing," Abigail said honestly. "I'm gathering information. It's what I do when I don't know what I'm dealing with." Ruth Calloway set down her coffee cup. "I'll make some introductions," she said. "Next week, there are 3 ranchers you should talk to." Abigail nodded. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." Ruth stood up, smoothing her skirt. "Mercer is patient, and he is not stupid, and when he figures out that you're asking questions, he'll respond." She looked down at Abigail with the kind of frank, unadorned assessment that Abigail had come to associate with women who had lived long enough to stop cushioning their honesty. "But I suspect you know that already." "I suspect I do," Abigail said. She watched Ruth move back into the gathering, the way a stone moves into water, displacing, adjusting, settling. And she sat there for a moment with the information she'd been given sitting in her chest like a shifted weight. Mercer wasn't just trying to buy a creek. Howe was building something. He'd been building it for 3 years, and he was nearly finished, and the Boone Ranch and its water source were the last piece he needed. She looked across the room again at Silas. He was laughing at something now, and she hadn't seen him do that before, laugh freely, without the guarded quality he usually carried. He caught her eye across the room and held it for a second, and she saw him register something in her face, the particular stillness she probably wore when she was working through a problem. He excused himself from the conversation and crossed the room. "What is it?" he said quietly. "I'll tell you on the way home," she said. "All of it." He didn't push. He nodded once and went to get their coats. She stood and thought. "I have a ledger with 3 months of records. I have a will and a letter from Pete Garner and an attorney in Ridgeline. I have a woman who will make introductions to ranchers with documented evidence of a pattern." She pressed her hand briefly against her coat pocket where the oilcloth sleeve with the will rested. "And I have a man who means what he says and comes to find me when something's wrong." It wasn't enough yet, but it was more than she'd had 6 months ago when she'd been sitting on a post office bench in February with 42 cents and an advertisement folded into thirds. She went to meet her husband at the door and they walked out into the Wyoming night together, and she told him everything she'd learned. The 3 ranchers Ruth Calloway introduced her to were not what Abigail expected, which was becoming a pattern she was learning to accept about Wyoming. She'd expected men who were angry, men who'd been squeezed by Mercer and had enough stored resentment to fill a barn. What she found instead were men who were tired, not defeated. There was a difference, and she knew it firsthand, but worn down by the specific exhaustion of people who'd been fighting something that moved too slowly to feel like a fight. The first was a man named Aldous Crane, who ran a modest cattle operation about 6 miles north of the Boone Ranch. He had a wife and 4 children, and a way of talking that was careful and measured, like a man who'd learned to think before speaking after getting burned by not doing so. He met Abigail at Ruth's millinery shop on a Tuesday morning because Ruth had arranged it that way, on neutral ground in a room full of hat forms and ribbon spools, where a conversation could look like nothing if anyone happened to glance through the window. Abigail brought her ledger. She'd started a new section in the back, not ranch finances this time, but dates, names, numbers. Everything Ruth had told her, organized into the form that made most sense to her, which was the form of evidence. Aldous Crane looked at the ledger with the expression of a man who'd never thought to do something that obvious and was slightly embarrassed about it. "You wrote it all down," he said. "I write everything down," Abigail said. "Tell me what happened with your water access. Start from the beginning." What Aldous Crane described took 40 minutes and a second cup of Ruth's coffee. Mercer had approached him 18 months ago with what looked like a straightforward proposition, a seasonal access agreement for Crane's East Creek, compensated at a rate that seemed fair. The document he'd signed was 4 pages and he'd read 2 of them, because the man Mercer had brought with him had explained the rest in a way that made it sound like the unread pages were just standard language. They were not standard language. "The clause on page 3, he said, with the flat tone of a man who'd read that page many times since, says that if my usage of the creek drops below a certain threshold during the dry season, if I reduce my herd for any reason, drought or disease, or just business sense, the access rights revert to him. Permanently." "So, if you have a bad year and reduce your herd," Abigail said, "you lose the creek. And then I pay him for access to my own water, which I've been doing for 8 months. She wrote that down. Amount, date, the clause number he gave her. Did anyone else sign something similar? He named 2 other ranchers. She already knew one of them, a man named Hector Pyle, who was the second introduction Ruth had arranged. The third was a woman named Dora Sims, who ran a sheep operation on the eastern edge of the valley, a widow who'd signed Mercer's document 6 months after her husband died, when she'd been too overwhelmed to read past page 2. She met all 3 of them over the course of a week. She listened. She wrote everything down. She asked the same questions in different orders because she'd learned from watching Gerald that people remembered different things when you came at a story from different angles, and the things they remembered the second time around were usually the more important things. What emerged from the 4 conversations was a pattern so consistent, it was almost elegant in the way that traps are elegant, clean, efficient, designed to look like something else, until you were already inside it. Mercer wasn't buying water rights. He was buying the right to become necessary. She laid it out for Silas that evening on the kitchen table with the ledger open between them. "He targets ranchers who are stretched," she said. "Not failing, just stretched. He offers a deal that looks like relief. The money's decent, the terms sound fair when someone explains them verbally." She tapped the ledger. "But the documents give him a trigger, something he can pull if he needs to, and he's patient enough to wait until he needs to." Silas studied the numbers. He was quiet for a long time. "If he gets access to Cutter's Creek," he said slowly, "he controls all of the significant water on the north end of the valley. And he'd control it in a way that looks legal, because it would be legal." She looked at him. "He's not stealing. He's constructing a situation where people have no reasonable choice but to deal with him." "That's worse," Silas said. "I know." He sat back. The lamp between them threw uneven light across the table, and she watched the shadows move on his face as he thought. Voss needs to see this, he said. I already wrote to him. I'm meeting him Thursday. She paused. I also think the other ranchers need to see each other's documents. How do you mean? Aldous Crane doesn't know what Hector Pyle signed. Hector doesn't know about Dora Sims. They've each been managing their situation privately, which is exactly how Mercer would want it. Isolated problems don't add up to a pattern. She looked at the ledger. A pattern is something you can show someone. Silas was looking at her with the expression she'd seen a handful of times now. Not soft exactly, but present in a way that felt like being fully seen, which was still something she was adjusting to. You're thinking about more than us, he said. Mercer is a problem for this whole valley. If he gets what he wants from us and we just... She stopped herself. I don't know how to just protect ourselves and watch him do it to the next person. I don't think I'm built that way. He didn't say anything to that. He closed the ledger carefully and pushed it back toward her side of the table. A small gesture, almost nothing, but she understood it. This is your work. I'm not taking it over. Thursday, he said. I'll come with you. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She nodded. All right. Voss read through her compiled notes with his eyebrows doing most of his expressing for him, rising slowly on the more interesting sections, pulling together on the clause Aldous Crane had described. This is not, he said after a long silence, a short conversation. I know. How many ranchers are we talking about? 3 who I've spoken to directly. Ruth Calloway thinks there are at least 2 more who haven't talked to anyone yet. Abigail sat straight in the grain dust-smelling office. If we could get copies of the documents they signed compared against Mercer's Creek proposal to us, it would demonstrate a pattern of practice, Voss said. He set the notes down, which isn't on its own illegal. No, Abigail said, but it changes what a refusal to sell means. It's not just one rancher being stubborn. It's one rancher being the last piece of a documented acquisition strategy. She looked at him steadily. That's a different kind of record. Voss looked at her over his glasses again, then at Silas, then back at her. How old did you say you were? He said. 18. He picked up his pencil. Let me tell you what we can and cannot do. What they could do, Voss explained, was document. They could compile the other ranchers' agreements and compare them against both Mercer's proposal to the Boones and against each other. They could establish that a pattern existed. They could not, at this stage, bring any legal claim. Mercer hadn't done anything technically actionable against the Boone Ranch yet, and the other ranchers had signed their documents voluntarily. What Voss could do, and would do, was send a letter to the Territorial Land Office documenting the pattern and requesting that any future water rights transactions in the Cutters Creek Valley be reviewed for compliance with existing property law. It won't stop him immediately, Voss said. It creates a record, Abigail said. A record he knows exists. That's the hope. Men like Mercer prefer to operate without a record. Yes, Voss said. They do. They walked out of the office into the ridgeline afternoon, and Silas was quiet for a stretch while they went to the wagon. She'd noticed he was often quiet after meetings that involved other people's problems. Not disengaged, just processing. He carried other people's situations with the same care he gave his own, which was something she'd observed gradually and found more affecting each time she noticed it. He's going to find out you've been talking to people, Silas said, when they were moving. I know. He'll come back. I'm counting on it, she said. He looked at her sideways. Abigail, if he comes back, it means we rattled something. Rattled things show you where the weak points are. She looked at the road ahead. I want to know where his weak points are. He was quiet for another mile. Then, you know you scare me a little. She turned to look at him, startled. His expression was completely serious. In a good way, he said. Mostly. She looked away. She was smiling, and she didn't try very hard to stop it. Mercer's response came not in person, but through a different channel, which was how she knew she'd unsettled him. It was a Thursday afternoon when a man she didn't recognize rode into the yard. Younger than Mercer's usual ranch hands, with a clean coat and the particular posture of someone who thought themselves important. He introduced himself as Dale Creed, associate of Mr. Calvin Mercer, and produced a letter from his coat with the formal care of a man who practiced formal care in front of a mirror. She took the letter and read it on the porch while he waited on his horse. It was, in the language of polite legal threat, a notification. Mercer had become aware, the letter stated, of certain conversations taking place in the valley regarding his business practices. He wished to clarify that all agreements entered into between himself and neighboring ranchers were legal and voluntary, and that any suggestion otherwise constituted potential defamation. He was writing, the letter concluded, as a courtesy. She folded the letter and looked up at Dale Creed. "Tell Mr. Mercer I received his letter," she said. "Will there be a response?" "Yes, through our attorney." She kept her voice pleasant. "You're welcome to water your horse at the trough before you go. It's a long ride back." Creed looked at her for a moment, then he watered the horse and left. She went inside and put the letter on the table next to Gerald's letter, which was still in the drawer. Then she sat down and allowed herself exactly 2 minutes of the particular kind of fear that lived behind her sternum, cold and precise and specific, before she got up and started writing to Voss. Silas came in from the barn at sundown and found her at the table. "He sent a letter," she said. She watched him read it. His face did the thing she'd seen it do with Gerald's letter. Closed down, assessed, came back open. "He's rattled," Silas said. "Yes. Rattled men do things they shouldn't." "Yes." She looked at him. "Or they escalate before they do something they shouldn't, which is why we need to move faster on getting the other rancher's documents to Voss." He sat down across from her. He'd been working hard. She could see it in the dirt on his hands, the set of his shoulders. He looked tired in the way of a man at the end of a full day, not a man at the end of his rope. She'd learned to tell the difference. "How much time do we have?" he asked. "I don't know, but less than we had this morning." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands. Then he said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "Before you came, last fall, when things were leaner than I'd said they were in the letters, Mercer made an offer, a real one. Not just water access, he offered to buy the whole property." He looked up. "I didn't take it, but I thought about it for 3 days." The kitchen was very quiet. "I don't know why I'm telling you this now," he said. "Maybe because you've been walking into this without all the information and you should have all of it." She looked at him across the table. "What stopped you?" "Pride, partly." He said it without apology. "I bought this place after everything fell apart 12 years ago. It's the first thing I've done in my adult life that was entirely mine." He paused. "And I didn't trust that Mercer's offer was what it looked like. A man who buys things at exactly the right moment has usually been engineering the moment." "He had," she said, "the lean season. He probably knew about the fence repairs, the feed costs. I think so too. Now." He spread his hands on the table. Then, "I just didn't trust it. Call it instinct." She looked at his hands. She thought about the winter before last, the fever, the 3 nights waking in a dark house, the 2 days no one would have known. She thought about the advertisement and the crossed out word and the letter she'd nearly memorized. "You should have told me this sooner," she said. "I know. Not because it changes anything. Because we said we'd tell each other the truth." "I know," he said again. She looked at him for a moment. He was not a man who apologized easily or elaborately. She'd observed this, but when he did it, he meant it without decoration. It landed accordingly. "All right," she said. "Now I know." He nodded. "Now you know. Was there anything else?" A pause. "No." "Then let's eat," she said, and got up to start supper. Gerald's next letter arrived on a Monday in early June, and it was nothing like the first one. The careful legal language was gone. What replaced it was the voice she remembered from childhood, the one that lived behind the reasonable surface, the one that came out when Gerald felt cornered and had decided to stop being careful. He'd found out about her marriage. She didn't know how, possibly through Millhaven, possibly through the territorial records, possibly through some connection she'd never be able to trace. But he knew she was Abigail Boone now, and he knew the Boone Ranch existed, and his letter made it clear that he intended to file a formal legal challenge to the will, not just on the grounds of abandonment, but on the grounds that her marriage to a Wyoming rancher represented a deliberate attempt to place assets beyond his reach. He was also, the letter made clear, going to contact Silas directly. To inform him, Gerald wrote, of certain facts regarding Abigail's history and character that he felt a husband had a right to know. She read the letter twice. Then she went outside and stood in the yard with her arms folded and breathed the cold morning air until she was certain of what she felt, which took longer than she would have liked. What she felt was not the old fear. It was there. She wasn't going to lie to herself about that, but underneath it was something harder and less familiar, something she'd been building for months without entirely noticing. The way you build a callus. Gradually, through repeated pressure, until you discover that a thing that used to hurt has stopped. She was angry. Not the helpless kind. Not the swallowed kind that sat in your chest for years and slowly poisoned the rest of you. The functional kind. The kind that moved your feet. She went inside and put the letter on the table and waited for Silas. He came in at mid-morning, read the letter, and when he finished, he set it down with a precision that told her he was choosing his words carefully. "What does he think he knows about your character?" he said. "He'll say I was difficult, that I refused to cooperate with reasonable arrangements regarding the farm, that I was—" She stopped, started again. "He used to tell people I was unstable, that my parents' death affected me. He'd say it with concern. It was very convincing." Silas was quiet. "He's going to tell you things that are technically true in the way that a frame is technically a picture," she said. "He'll find things that sound damning without context, and he'll give them to you without context." Silas looked at her. "Abigail," he said, "I've been watching you for 3 months. I've seen how you handle fear and hard weather and a cattle loss and legal threats and a man like Mercer." A pause. "If your uncle shows up here with a collection of things he'd like me to know about you, I promise you I will not be shocked by any of them." She held his gaze for a moment. "He might try to come in person," she said. "That would be his mistake. He can be convincing." "So can you," Silas said. "You're better at it." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the steadiness that had been the first thing she'd noticed about him, the way he held things that needed holding. "We need to write to Voss today," she said. "I'll ride to Ridgeline this afternoon. Both letters, Gerald's and Mercer's. He needs the full picture." "All right." He picked up his hat. "Don't spend the morning talking yourself into being more worried than the situation warrants." "I spend every morning doing exactly that." "I know." He put the hat on. "It's how you prepare. I'm not saying stop. I'm saying, remember, you have more than you had before." He went out. She stood at the table for a moment. Then she opened the ledger and started writing. Ruth Calloway appeared at the ranch 2 days later, which was unexpected because Ruth did not make house calls as a general practice. She arrived in a small wagon driven by her nephew, climbed down with the dignity of a woman who climbed down from wagons on her own terms, and came to the door with the focused expression of someone carrying information. Abigail let her in and put coffee on and waited. "Mercer talked to Aldous Crane yesterday," Ruth said, before she'd even sat down. "Offered him a renegotiated deal on the water access, better terms, more money." Abigail set down the coffee pot. "When?" "Yesterday afternoon. Crane came to see me last evening because he didn't know what to do." Ruth looked at her. Mercer told him the new terms were contingent on Crane stepping back from, his words were, the ongoing misunderstanding about valley water arrangements. "He told Aldous to stop talking to me. He told Aldous the new deal went away if Aldous continued to cooperate with what Mercer called a campaign of misinformation." Abigail sat down across from Ruth and was quiet for a moment. The coffee was brewing behind her, and the ranch was doing its usual sounds outside, and she thought, this is what escalation looks like. Not dramatic, just a door being closed quietly in a face. "What did Aldous say?" "He hasn't decided yet." Ruth looked at her directly. "He has 4 children and a bad mortgage year, and Mercer's offer is money he needs. I'm not going to tell you it's an easy choice for him." "No," Abigail said. "It isn't." "The question I came to ask you," Ruth said, "is what you have to offer him instead. Because if all you have is principle, Aldous Crane is not in a position to afford principle right now." It was blunt and it was true, and Abigail appreciated both. She looked at the table for a moment. "What does his renegotiated deal look like, specifically?" Ruth told her. The number was better than the original. The terms were still structured with the same clause. The trigger that would revert access rights if the herd fell below threshold, but buried differently, with different language. "It's the same trap," Abigail said. "It is, but he needs money now, not protection from a trap that might spring in 3 years." Abigail thought. She thought about the ledger, about the Ridgeline feed supplier she'd negotiated a better rate from, about the east fence that needed lumber. She thought about what Voss had told them and what Voss hadn't told them, and what she'd been turning over for 2 weeks about the pattern, the documents, the record she was building. Then she thought about something else. Something that had been at the edge of her thinking for a while, that she hadn't yet fully faced. "If Mercer controls the creek," she said slowly, "what does that do to the surrounding land values in the valley?" Ruth frowned. "They'd go down, significantly. Any operation without guaranteed water access becomes a risk. And if he then offered to buy those operations at the depressed price," Ruth was very still. He's not just after the water, Abigail said. He's after the land. The water is the mechanism. She looked at Ruth. He's going to own this valley, all of it. That's what this has always been. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a wind came through and moved the grass on the slope, and the cattle in the lower pasture shifted and resettled. If that's true, Ruth said carefully, then Aldous Crane's 3-year trap springs a lot sooner than 3 years. Yes. Can you prove it? Not yet. Abigail got up and went to the ledger and brought it back to the table, open to the new section. She laid it between them. But the land purchase records are public, and if Mercer or anyone connected to him has been buying land in this valley, not just water rights, but actual land, at any point in the last 5 years, it would show a pattern consistent with what I'm describing. Ruth looked at the ledger. She looked at Abigail. She was silent for a stretch that felt longer than it probably was. I know a man at the Territorial Records Office, she said. We went to school together 40 years ago. He owes me a favor that is too undignified to discuss. She closed the ledger and pushed it back. Give me a week. After Ruth left, Abigail stood at the kitchen window and let herself feel the full weight of what had shifted in the last hour. If she was right, if Mercer's plan was what she now believed it was, then this was no longer a fight about one ranch or one creek. It was a fight about the shape of an entire valley, about what happened to the people in it. Silas came in from the range at late afternoon, hat dusty and mood somewhere in the middling range that meant the day had been functional, if not good. He looked at her face and stopped taking his hat off. What happened? He said. She told him, all of it, in order, the way she'd learned to tell him things. His expression moved through several stages. The closed-down assessing look, then something sharper, then a kind of quiet anger that she recognized as the type that didn't burn fast but burn long. He's going to squeeze Aldous Crane, he said. He's trying to cut off what we're building before it becomes something he can't manage. Can we help Aldous? Financially? She looked at him. We don't have enough to match what Mercer's offering. No. He sat down. Thought. But the territorial records, if Ruth's contact finds what you're looking for? It becomes a different kind of fight, Abigail said, one with more people in it. He was quiet. She watched him sit with it. The weight of it, the scope. He wasn't a man who operated at this scale naturally. He was a man who fixed fences and watched weather and worried about his cattle and tried to do right by the people in his immediate vicinity. She understood that about him. She understood also that he was larger than that scope, had always been, and had simply never been asked to prove it. All right, he said. All right, what? All right, we do whatever comes next. He looked at her. I'm not going to understand all of it as fast as you do, but I'm not going to slow you down either. She held his gaze. There was something she wanted to say. Something that had been building for weeks, maybe months, that she hadn't found the right moment or the right form for. Something about what it meant to her, specifically, to have a person who said, we, the way he said we, without making it a condition or a bargain or a thing that could be retracted. She didn't say it. Not yet, but she held it, the way she'd held the folded advertisement on the post office bench, carefully, aware of its weight. I'll need your help with the Crane situation, she said. He knows you. He trusts you more than he trusts me right now. I'll go see him tomorrow. Don't push. Just be there. I know how to be there, he said, not unkindly. She almost smiled. I know you do. That was Thursday. On Friday morning, before Silas had left to ride out to see Aldous Crane, the third piece arrived, not from Mercer, not from Gerald, but from a direction she hadn't been watching. A young woman appeared at the gate. She was perhaps 16, small, with dark eyes and a way of holding herself that Abigail recognized before she'd crossed the yard to meet her. The posture of someone who had learned to make themselves smaller than they were, who'd gotten accustomed to taking up less space as a form of self-protection. She said her name was Clara. Her father ran a feed operation on the south side of Ridgeline. She'd heard, she said, through someone who'd heard through someone, the way things traveled in a place this size, that Mrs. Boone had come from Ohio on an advertisement, that she'd come with nothing and was still standing. Abigail brought her inside. She put coffee on, which she seemed to be doing every time someone arrived with something important to say. Clara sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and looked at the table and said that her father had accepted a marriage arrangement on her behalf. The man was a rancher north of the valley, 54 years old, a widower with 3 children. She had not been asked. She was supposed to leave in 3 weeks. What do you want? Abigail said. Clara looked up, visibly startled by the directness of the question. I want to know, Clara said, if it's possible to have a say. Abigail sat across from her and was quiet for a moment. She thought about a post office bench in February and 42 cents, and a folded advertisement, and the particular feeling of having nowhere to go but forward. Yes, she said, it's possible. It's not easy, and it's not without cost, but it's possible. She looked at the girl. Tell me what you know about the arrangement. Start from the beginning. Clara started from the beginning. Outside, Silas paused on the porch where he'd been about to leave for the Crane place. Through the window, he could hear the low murmur of his wife's voice, patient, steady, asking the right questions. The voice of a person who knew how to sit with someone who was frightened because she had spent most of her life being frightened herself and had figured out, the hard way, what actually helped. He stood there for a moment, hat in hand, listening without meaning to. Then he went to his horse and rode to see Aldous Crane, and he carried with him, all the way down the valley road, the particular feeling of a man who has found himself in the right place at the right time, not by luck, but by finally asking the right question. Silas came back from the Crane place at late afternoon with mud on his boots and a quietness about him that told her the conversation had gone somewhere real. She was still at the table with Clara when she heard the horse, and she caught the girl's eye. "That's my husband. You don't have to go. But if you'd rather not have an audience, there's time." Clara thought about it. "I'll stay," she said, "if that's all right." "It's your choice," Abigail said. She meant it as a simple statement of fact and watched Clara receive it like something she hadn't expected. A small, visible shift, the way a person looks when they've been handed a thing they forgot they were allowed to have. Silas came in, registered Clara's presence without making anything of it, and hung his hat on the hook. He looked at Abigail once, a look that said, "Later." And then he went to the wash basin and cleaned up and poured himself coffee and sat at the far end of the table with the deliberate, unobtrusive quality of a man who understood that his presence was a variable someone else was still calculating. She appreciated that about him more than she could easily say. She finished her conversation with Clara. They had been talking for the better part of 2 hours, and what had emerged was both simpler and harder than Clara had perhaps expected when she'd ridden out here. The man her father had arranged for her to marry was not cruel as far as anyone knew. He was simply a stranger, 54 years old, selected not for any quality Clara possessed or needed, but for the quality of the arrangement. The practical exchange of a daughter's future for a business relationship that benefited her father's feed operation. "I'm not going to tell you what to do," Abigail said. "I can't. Your situation isn't the same as mine was, and the advice that helped me might make things worse for you, but I can tell you what your options look like." She laid them out plainly. Clara could speak to her father directly, which meant identifying what she was willing to say and what she was willing to risk. She could speak to someone her father respected, a third party, and request that the arrangement be delayed. She could, if things were worse than she'd indicated, find resources to leave. And she could accept the arrangement while working from the inside towards something better. "None of those are good," Clara said. "No," Abigail said, "they're not good, they're real. Good would be not being in this position, but you're already in it, so we work with what's real." Clara was quiet. She had the look of someone absorbing something they'd half known but needed to hear said directly. "I'll talk to my father," she said finally. "I don't know what he'll do, but I haven't tried that yet. I've been afraid to try." "What's your father like? When he's not managing things?" A pause. "He's not a bad man," Clara said. "He just doesn't think about what I want, not because he wants to hurt me, because it hasn't occurred to him to ask." Abigail nodded. "Then ask him to ask. What if he won't? Then you come back and we think about what comes next." She looked at the girl steadily. "You're not out of options. You feel like you are, but you're not. There's a difference." Clara left as the sun was going orange behind the ridge. Abigail stood on the porch and watched her ride back toward town and then went inside, where Silas was still at the table, coffee long finished, waiting. "Aldous," she said. "He's not signing Mercer's new deal," Silas said. "Not yet. I didn't ask him to wait. I just told him what you think is actually happening. The land play behind the water play." He looked at the table. "He's scared. He's got real reasons to be scared, but he's smarter than Mercer thinks he is, and when I laid it out the way you laid it out to me, I could see him doing the math. Did he say he'd wait? He said he'd give us 2 weeks before he made any decision. That's not a commitment, but it's room. 2 weeks. She filed it. The way she filed everything, as a number with a deadline attached. Ruth's contact at the records office needs to come through in that time. Can you push on it? I'll write to Ruth tonight. She sat down across from him. The kitchen was in the specific kind of late-day quiet that came after a full day of movement and people and decisions, a quality of silence that wasn't empty but settling. "The girl," she said. "Clara." I gathered. "Her father's arranged a marriage. She didn't have a say." A pause. "She came here because she'd heard about the advertisement." Silas looked at her. "What did you tell her?" "The truth about her options." She folded her hands. "I don't know if it helped. I know I said things I needed someone to say to me once, and nobody did." He was quiet for a moment. "That's what helped," he said simply. She looked at him. He was looking at the table, turning his coffee cup in a slow circle with 2 fingers, a habit she'd catalogued months ago, a thing he did when he was sitting with something he found meaningful but didn't know how to dress up. "Silas," she said. He looked up. "What did you say to Aldous, specifically, when you explained Mercer's plan?" He thought about it. "I told him what you told me. The water first, then the land values, then the buyout at a depressed price. I told him the documents he signed were designed to give Mercer a trigger, and that the new deal was the same trap with a nicer bow on it." He paused. "He asked me how I knew all that. I told him my wife figured it out." She blinked. "You said that." "It's true." He looked at her steadily. He needed to know where it was coming from. People trust the source when the source is honest. Aldous knows me. If I say you figured it out, he believes it because I believe it. She didn't know what to say to that, which was unusual for her. She looked at her hands for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't do anything remarkable." "You did," she said. "You just don't realize it." He made the small sound that might be a laugh. She was, by now, certain it was. Ruth's letter arrived 6 days later and contained 3 pages of notes in Ruth's precise, slightly old-fashioned handwriting. Her contact at the Territorial Records Office had, with a degree of discretion Ruth described as heroic and would have to be compensated for at some point, in a way Ruth found personally embarrassing, pulled 5 years of land transaction records for the Cutters Creek Valley. What the records showed made Abigail sit down. Calvin Mercer had not purchased land in the valley directly. His name appeared nowhere in the land transaction records, but 3 other names appeared repeatedly over the past 4 years, purchasing small parcels, sometimes shares of parcels, sometimes mineral and water easements. A company called Ridgeline Grazing and Pasture Associates, an individual named George Fells, a woman named Agnes Beauchard, whose listed address was a postbox in the territorial capital that did not correspond to any residential property. Agnes Beauchard. Abigail stared at that name for a long time. Then she wrote to Voss, laying out the 3 names and what Ruth's contact had found. She asked him to look into the company, Ridgeline Grazing and Pasture Associates, specifically whether it was registered with the territorial government and who its principals were. Voss wrote back in 4 days. He was, she noticed, writing back faster than he had in February. She chose to take that as a sign of either increasing interest or increasing concern, and suspected it was both. Ridgeline Grazing and Pasture Associates was registered. Its 3 listed principals were George Fells, Agnes Beauchard, and a silent partner listed only as a trust instrument, the kind of legal structure, Voss noted, that was designed to put distance between a controlling interest and a public record. Voss could not prove the trust was Mercer, but in the letter, in his precise 60-year-old handwriting, he wrote, "The structure is consistent with someone who wishes to acquire assets without appearing to do so. I have seen this approach twice before in my career. Both times, the party at the center of the structure was a man who had reason to believe his direct acquisition would attract scrutiny." She brought the letter to Silas that evening. He read it twice. Then he set it down with the particular deliberateness she associated with him working through anger in real time. "He's been buying up this valley through a shell," he said, "for at least 4 years. While he was having polite conversations with every rancher about water access." He looked at her. "While he was having polite conversations with me." "Yes. That's..." He stopped, started again. "That's not just opportunism. That's a plan, a long plan. A very long plan," she said, "which means the water access agreements are step 2 or 3, not step 1. The land purchases came first. He's already positioned to control significant portions of the valley. He just needs the creek. Which we're sitting on. Which we're sitting on." The end. They looked at each other across the table, and Abigail watched him take the full measure of it. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical gravity of a man in a story, but the way a real person absorbs a real threat, slowly, with some resistance, and then with the shifting weight of a person who has accepted the truth of something and is now dealing with what comes after. Voss needs to take this to the Territorial Land Office, Silas said. I already wrote asking him to. I also asked him about whether the trust structure could be legally challenged. Can it? He doesn't know yet, but the pattern of acquisition, if it can be linked to Mercer, changes the context of every water access agreement in this valley. Those ranchers signed documents with a private citizen. If they actually signed with what amounts to a coordinated acquisition entity, there may be grounds to argue the agreements weren't entered into honestly. She paused. That's not a guarantee, but it's a question worth asking in front of someone official. He was quiet for a stretch. Aldous is 2 weeks. I know. Do we have enough to show him now? Enough to show him the shape of it, not enough to give him legal certainty. She looked at the letter, but enough to make staying out of Mercer's new deal the obvious choice, if he can see the whole picture. He needs to see the whole picture. Then we show him. She looked up. All three of them. Aldous, Hector, Dora Sims. Together, not separately. I want them in the same room, looking at the same information at the same time. Silas considered this. Ruth's? Ruth's. She'll agree. She already knows most of it. She began moving papers back into their organized stacks. Can you arrange it? They'll hear it from you differently than from me. That's just true. I can arrange it. He watched her hands on the papers. You're not bothered by that. By what? That they'll hear it better from me. That you have to route it through me. She looked at him. I spent 3 months of my life doing things alone that would have gone better with help because I didn't want to need help. And before that, I spent 9 years in Gerald's house because needing help felt like weakness. She picked up the Voss letter and folded it. I'm done with that. You're good at certain things I'm not. I'm good at certain things you're not. That's not routing. That's sense. He was still watching her. What? She said. Nothing. He picked up his hat. I'll ride out to see Aldous tomorrow and arrange the meeting. She nodded. He went to the door, then he stopped, which he sometimes did. A pause at the threshold that she'd come to understand was him deciding whether to say the thing he was thinking or let it go. Abigail. Yes. He didn't turn around. When all of this is finished, Mercer, your uncle, all of it, I want to do something normal for a while. She waited. Ride out to the east pasture on a Saturday and do nothing but fix whatever's broken and eat lunch out there. He paused. With you. She held that for a moment. All right, she said. He went out. She heard his boots on the porch, the horse, the yard sounds resuming. She sat at the table with the papers in front of her and thought that she had not in her entire life been offered a Saturday afternoon as a form of commitment, and that it was, in the particular vocabulary of Silas Boone, exactly that. Gerald arrived on a Wednesday. She hadn't expected him in person, which was her mistake. She'd been thinking of Gerald as a letter writer, a man who operated through documents and distance and the manipulation of information. She'd forgotten that Gerald was also a man who showed up when he thought his physical presence would accomplish what paper couldn't. She was coming back from the barn when the wagon appeared on the road. She recognized the set of his shoulders before she recognized his face, the way you recognize a type of weather before it arrives, the specific quality of approaching trouble you've known long enough to read at a distance. She stopped in the middle of the yard and waited. He climbed down from the hired wagon with the slightly theatrical care of a man performing reasonableness. He was 51, gray at the temples now, heavier than she remembered. He looked around the ranch with the evaluating expression she'd seen him use on everything her whole life, every room, every person, every situation, sizing it up for what he could get from it. Then he looked at her. Abigail, he said. Warm, careful. Uncle Gerald, she said, flat, also careful. You look well. He moved toward the gate. Stop there, she said. He stopped. Something flickered in his face. Surprise, then the practiced recalibration she remembered, the thing he did when the first approach didn't work. I came to talk. Surely we can talk here, she said. What do you want? He looked around again, at the barn, the yard, the house. She understood he was calculating the ranch's value the same way he'd always calculated everything. I've come because I think our correspondence has gotten unnecessarily adversarial, he said. I don't want a legal fight, Abigail. I never did. I wanted to have a conversation about the farm, about what's fair. The farm belongs to me, she said. It belonged to my mother, and she left it to me. That conversation has been had. You're 18 years old. He said it gently, with the specific gentleness of a man who'd learned that saying cruel things gently made people question whether the cruelty was really there. You're in a territory hundreds of miles from home, married to a man you met through a paper advertisement. That's a lot of decisions for someone who what? She said. He paused, tried a different angle. I'm your family, he said. The only family you have left. I know things have been difficult between us, but I came all this way because I'm concerned. A proper conversation. You came all this way, she said, because Edmund Voss sent a letter to the Ohio courts documenting your preliminary inquiry and requesting that your contest of the will be treated as what it is, which is an attempt to claim property that was never yours. She watched him. You came because you realized the distance isn't protecting you the way you thought it would. Gerald's face shifted. She'd seen this before too, the warm layer coming off, not in a burst, but in a slow withdrawal like a tide going out. Your mother's will has irregularities, he said. His voice was different now. The warmth was gone, and what was under it was what she'd grown up with, hard and patient and accustomed to winning. And your abandonment of the property is documented, she said. Pete Garner's letter, the oversight arrangement, it's all in Voss's files. Silence. The farm is mine, she said. The legal challenge will fail. You know it will fail, which is why you're here instead of in a courtroom. She looked at him. There is nothing to discuss, Gerald. He looked at her for a long moment. She'd grown up being looked at this way. Assessed, measured, the slight narrowing of his eyes that meant he was deciding what tool to use next. She'd spent years flinching under that look. Standing in her own yard on a Wednesday morning, she noticed she wasn't flinching. Your husband, Gerald said. Does he know everything about you? Yes. Does he know that you were asked to leave 3 positions in Millhaven before you answered that advertisement? That you have a history of difficulty cooperating with people who treated me like property? She said. Yes, he knows. We've discussed it at length. He finds it understandable. Something moved through Gerald's face. She'd never talked back this directly. Not once. In 9 years. She'd been strategic, she'd been careful, she'd navigated, but she hadn't ever just looked at him and said the thing plainly. You've changed, he said. Yes, she said. I have. Thank you for noticing. The sound of a horse made them both turn. Silas was coming down from the north pasture, not at a run, not dramatically, just riding back at his usual pace and taking in the scene as he approached with the particular calm attention of a man who sees a thing and doesn't react until he understands it. He pulled up and dismounted and came through the gate and stood beside Abigail with his hat in his hand. Silas, she said, this is my uncle Gerald Harper. He was just leaving. Silas looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at Silas. It was, Abigail thought, a remarkably unambiguous 30 seconds of 2 men reading each other. Mr. Harper, Silas said. Mr. Boone. Gerald tried one more angle. I'd hoped we could speak man to man. About Abigail. About some things? She just told you she was leaving. My wife doesn't need me to speak for her. He said it without heat. Factual. Final. But if you have business to conduct, you can contact our attorney. His name is Edmund Voss. He's in Ridgeline. Gerald looked at both of them. He was not a man who surrendered easily or gracefully, but he was also, at his core, a man who operated on calculation, and the calculation here was plain. This was not going to work. He climbed back into the hired wagon. He gathered the reins. He looked at Abigail one last time with an expression that was complicated and that she didn't try to simplify because his feelings were not her responsibility and hadn't been for a long time. You'll regret cutting off your family, he said. You were never my family, she said. You were the person living in my parents' house. He drove out. She and Silas stood in the yard and watched until the wagon turned onto the road and disappeared in the direction of town. Then they stood there a moment longer. He won't be back, Silas said. No, he can't afford to keep pressing. Voss's letter changed the calculation. She let out a slow breath. He'll try one more thing through the courts. Voss says we're prepared for it. After that, she stopped. After that, I think it's done. How do you feel? She thought about it. She gave the question the honesty it deserved. Strange, she said. Like I've been braced for something for so long that I don't know what my spine does when it stops. He looked at her. Probably relaxes, he said. She almost laughed. It came out more like exhaled air, but it was close. Probably. They went inside. She made coffee. He sat at the table and she sat across from him, and neither of them said anything for a while. And the silence was the kind she'd stopped being surprised by. Full, not empty, the sound of two people existing in the same space without needing to perform anything. The meeting with Aldous and the others, she said finally. Did you set it? Saturday at Ruth's, all three of them confirmed. She nodded. I'll bring the documents. I know. She looked at her coffee. Silas. Yeah. Thank you for what you said to him. About my wife doesn't need me to speak for her. He was quiet for a moment. That's just true. I know, but you said it. He turned his cup in its slow circle. You'd have handled it fine without me. Yes, she said, but you were there. That's not nothing. The Saturday meeting at Ruth's millinery was not what Abigail would have described as smooth. Real things rarely were. Aldous Crane arrived first, still carrying the weight of his private calculations, the way a man carries financial stress, not visibly but everywhere, in the set of his shoulders and the speed of his words and the things he didn't say. Hector Pyle came in behind him, older, more settled in his anger, which had apparently been sitting for a while waiting for an outlet. Dora Sims arrived last, a compact, gray-haired woman in her late 40s who walked with a cane and looked at everything in the room once, quickly, before deciding where she was going to sit. Ruth had cleared the back room and set up chairs around a table. She put coffee on and stood in the corner with the alert stillness of a woman who intended to observe rather than manage, which Abigail appreciated. Silas sat to Abigail's left. She'd asked him to let her lead, and he'd nodded once when she'd said it that morning, and that was the entire conversation. She laid the documents on the table. The Voss correspondence, the records Ruth's contact had pulled, her own compiled notes from the conversations with Aldous, Hector, and Dora, organized so that each person could see their own situation alongside the others. She did not open with a speech. She'd thought about it and decided against it. She just put the papers where people could see them and said, I want to show you something. When I'm done, you can tell me if I'm wrong. She walked them through it. The water access agreements first. Not their individual agreements, but the structure, the clause, the trigger. Each of them had signed a version of the same document. Each version had the same fundamental mechanism. Then the land records, the three names, Ridgeline Grazing and Pasture Associates, George Fells, Agnes Beauchard. Then Voss's letter about the trust instrument and the unnamed controlling interest. She watched them read. She'd learned to do this, to present information and then be quiet while people absorbed it, because the absorption was the work, and interrupting it with more words just got in the way. Dora Sims spoke first. The woman, she said. Agnes Beauchard. Is she real? The name is real. The address is a postbox. We don't know yet if she's a real person or a name on a document. George Fells, Hector said. I know a George Fells. He sold his operation 3 years ago and left the territory. I didn't know he'd bought anything. Abigail looked at him. Where did he go? After he sold? Hector thought. East, I heard. His wife had family somewhere in Kansas. He paused. He was doing well here, actually. Good cattle, good land. Then one season, he just decided to sell and go. A different pause, slower. Mercer bought his land. The room was quiet. Mercer bought his land, Aldous said slowly, and then George Fells's name starts appearing in the records as a buyer through the company. Which Mercer presumably controls through the trust, Abigail said. We can't prove the connection yet, but the pattern is, it's him, Dora Sims said, not a question. I believe so. So does Voss, but belief isn't what changes things. What changes things? Aldous asked. He asked it the way a man asks who needs the answer to be practical, not philosophical. A formal inquiry by the Territorial Land Office, she said, which Voss can request if we give him a comprehensive picture, the documents, the land records, the pattern, not just our ranch's situation. All of it, together. She looked at each of them. Separately were 3 or 4 ranchers who signed documents we didn't read carefully enough. Together were evidence of a coordinated acquisition strategy by an entity that didn't disclose its interests. And the agreements we signed? Dora said. Voss thinks there may be grounds to challenge them. He's not certain. But if the controlling interest behind the company and the agreements can be identified as the same person who was simultaneously negotiating water access, that's a different situation than voluntary private contracts. Hector put down the paper he'd been holding. What do you need from us? I need copies of your agreements, whatever you signed. and I need you to be willing to be named in Voss's inquiry as parties to the pattern." "That means Mercer knows we cooperated," Aldous said. "Yes." "He's already made me a new offer. If I cooperate with this and it doesn't work—" "If it doesn't work," she said, "you're in the same position you're in now. Mercer keeps the access rights, keeps the trigger, keeps the long game running." She looked at him. "If it does work, if the inquiry finds what Voss thinks it will find, those agreements may be void. And the creek stays mine, which means the valley's water balance stays what it's been." Aldous rubbed his face. He was a man doing real math, not dramatic math, and she respected him for it, even though the suspense of it made her want to say something that would tip the scales. She didn't. She waited. "My wife," he said, "read that first agreement the night after I signed it. She said something was wrong with page 3. He stopped. "I told her she was reading it wrong. Nobody said anything." "All right," Aldous said. "I'm in." Hector nodded. "Same." Dora Sims looked at Abigail directly. "You're 18 years old and you put this together." "Yes." "How?" Abigail thought about the honest answer. "I've been keeping evidence since I was 13, she said. "I didn't know what I'd need it for. I just knew that people who want to take things from you depend on you not having a record." She paused. "I've always kept a record." Dora looked at her for another moment. Then she said, "I'll get you the agreement. It's in my safe at home. I'll have it to you by Monday." Ruth Calloway made a sound from her corner that was not quite a word. Abigail glanced at her. Ruth was looking at the table with an expression that Abigail had come to understand as Ruth's version of being moved. A tightening around the eyes, nothing performative, private. She collected the documents at the end of the meeting, and as the ranchers filed out, she stood by the door and shook each hand, and Aldous Crane stopped in front of her and looked at her for a moment, the way people look when they're deciding whether to say the thing they're thinking. "My wife's name is Ellen," he said. "She'll want to know how this turns out." "Tell her she was right about page 3, Abigail said. He nodded and went out. The room was quiet. Silas came to stand beside her. "Voss on Monday?" he said. "Monday," she confirmed. He picked up the stack of documents and held them while she got her coat. Outside, through the millinery window, she could see the ridgeline street in the afternoon light. Aldous Crane talking to Hector Pyle by the hitching post, both of them with a quality she recognized as men who have made a decision and feel the specific relief of no longer having it unmade. She thought about Clara. She hadn't heard back yet. She thought about the girl's dark eyes and the way she'd said, "I haven't tried that yet," and she hoped, in the practical way she hoped for things now, not wishfully, but actively, that trying had been enough. She thought about Silas's Saturday afternoon, the east pasture, fixing things, eating lunch. She thought about how long it had been since she'd done something without it being in service of surviving something else. She took the documents from Silas and put them in her bag, and he held the door for her, and they went out into the afternoon together, and she let herself feel, for the length of the walk to the wagon, the specific weight of what they'd built. Not finished, not safe yet, but real. Load-bearing. The kind of thing that holds. Voss filed the formal inquiry with the Territorial Land Office on a Tuesday, 11 days later, and by the following Friday, Calvin Mercer had withdrawn his water access proposal to the Boone Ranch in writing, without explanation, through a letter delivered by a man who was not Dale Creed and who did not make eye contact with anyone in the yard. She read the letter at the kitchen table. She read it twice to make sure she'd read it right. Then she set it down. Silas was watching her from across the table. "He withdrew," she said. "I see that." The inquiry rattled him. If the land office starts pulling the same records Ruth's contact pulled, the trust structure becomes visible. He can't afford the scrutiny. She looked up. He might try again. A different angle, a different approach. Men like Mercer don't stop, they redirect. "I know," Silas said. "We need to stay." "Abigail." His voice was gentle. "Can we be finished for today?" She stopped. I was looking at her with the patient attention that had been the second thing she'd noticed about him. After the steadiness. Not asking her to stop being herself, just asking her to put it down for an evening, the weight of it, the vigilance. She looked at the letter, at the ledger on the table beside it, at the stack of correspondence from Voss and the notes she'd been keeping. She thought about a girl on a post office bench in February. She thought about a crossed out word in a letter from Wyoming. She closed the ledger. "Yes," she said, "we can be finished for today." The east pasture on a Saturday turned out to be exactly what Silas had promised, and nothing more than that, which was the point. They rode out after breakfast with tools in the saddlebag and a wrapped lunch Abigail had packed without thinking too hard about it, bread, hard cheese, 2 apples, a jar of cold coffee that she knew he preferred to hot when he was working outdoors. The morning was clear and cool, the kind of late summer day that felt like a gift the season hadn't intended to give, and the grass on the east slope had the dry gold color of a place that had been through something and come out the other side. The fence needed work in 3 places. Not emergency work, the kind of slow deterioration that happens when a man has been managing everything alone and the non-urgent things accumulate. She'd noted it in the ledger 2 months ago. They worked their way down the line without much conversation. Silas doing the postwork and Abigail handling the wire. And she found a rhythm in it that was different from the rhythm of the last several months. Not the rhythm of urgency or strategy or managing several things at once, but the plain rhythm of physical work done alongside another person for no reason except that it needed doing. By mid-morning, her shoulders ached and she had a new scratch on her left hand from the wire and a smear of rust on her sleeve. She was already calculating whether it would come out in the wash. She sat down on the grass beside the fence line and opened the jar of cold coffee. Silas sat beside her. Not close, not far. The appropriate distance of 2 people who had stopped performing distance. 3rd post from the end, he said, squinting at what they'd left. I see it. It needs replacing, not just resetting. I know. We don't have the right lumber today. I'll get it in town Monday. She handed him the jar and he drank and handed it back, and they sat looking at the valley below them. The ranch buildings small from up here, the creek line glinting through the grass to the west, the ridge on the far side going blue in the distance. She'd thought when she first arrived that the sky here was too big, that she didn't know how to exist under something that vast without feeling exposed. She'd been wrong about that, as it turned out. What the size of it did, once you stopped bracing against it, was make everything underneath it feel proportional. Problems that had seemed absolute and containing revealed their actual size against that sky, and that size was finite, manageable, survivable. I heard from Voss yesterday, she said. I was going to wait until Monday to tell you, but tell me now. Gerald dropped the legal challenge. She looked at her coffee jar. Formally, in writing, through Voss's counterpart in the Ohio courts. He cited, she almost smiled, he cited the wish to preserve family relationships. Silas made a sound that was definitively a laugh this time. She'd been counting them for months, cataloging the occasions. This was the clearest one yet. Family relationships, he said. That's what it says. The man who showed up here and told you that you'd regret cutting off your family. The very same. She looked at the grass. Voss says it's done. The will stands. The farm stands. Pete Garner's oversight arrangement has been formalized in the Ohio records. She paused. It's actually mine. She'd known it was hers. She'd known it legally and practically and in every document she'd compiled. But there was a difference, she was discovering, between knowing a thing and feeling it. Between the intellectual certainty and the moment it settled into your body as simply true, without the residue of threat under it. She felt it now, sitting on the grass of the east pasture with rust on her sleeve and cold coffee in her hand. Her parents' farm was hers. The apple trees her mother had planted were still standing in Ohio, and they were hers. The legal fact of that had been tested and had held. You all right? Silas asked. Yes. She took a breath. I think I'm just finished carrying it, and I'm noticing what that feels like. He didn't say anything, which was the right thing not to say. She ate half her apple. He ate his bread. The valley below went about its business in the morning light, and a hawk worked a thermal somewhere above them, patient and unhurried, and she sat in the ordinary goodness of the moment and let it be what it was. The Territorial Land Office inquiry into ridgeline grazing and pasture associates took 6 weeks from Voss's filing to produce its first substantive response, and when it came in the form of a letter that Voss forwarded to Abigail with a note that said, in his precise handwriting, "This is what accountability looks like when it moves slowly but moves correctly." The inquiry had found sufficient evidence of undisclosed controlling interest in the water access agreements to warrant a formal review. The review would examine whether the agreements signed by Aldous Crane, Hector Pyle, Dora Sims, and 2 other ranchers whose names Abigail didn't recognize had been entered into, with full disclosure of the contracting parties' identities and interests. Calvin Mercer's name still did not appear in the inquiry documents, but the trust instrument, the silent partner behind Ridgeline Grazing and Pasture Associates, had been flagged for disclosure in the review process. A man who had spent 4 years ensuring his name didn't appear in any record was about to be asked to appear in one. She brought the letter to Ruth first because Ruth had made it possible. Ruth read it at her shop counter on a Tuesday morning with the steady attention she gave everything, and when she finished, she set it down and looked at Abigail. "He's going to fight it," Ruth said. "I know, he has resources and he has patience. But the record exists now." "The record exists," Abigail said. "Whatever he does next, it exists." Ruth was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter. "You know what this valley was 3 years ago," she said. "Before you arrived." She paused. "Mercer would have had the creek by now. Probably had Aldous' place too, within a year of the trigger springing. And then Hector's, and then..." She stopped. It would have looked like a series of unrelated business decisions. "And now it looks like a pattern," Abigail said. "Now it looks like a pattern, in front of someone official." Ruth looked up. "You did that. We did that," Abigail said. "You and your contact at the records office. Voss, Aldous and Hector and Dora for being willing to be named. Silas for..." She paused, finding the right word. "For being someone it was possible to build something with." Ruth looked at her with the particular quality of attention she deployed when she thought something was worth examining closely. "You've changed," she said, "since February. Everyone keeps saying that, because it's worth saying." Ruth picked up the letter and folded it with the crisp efficiency she gave everything. "The woman who came in here 8 months ago asking about a water rights pattern because she'd figured it out from 3 conversations and a ledger. She was already remarkable, but she was carrying everything alone. She didn't know how to let people stand beside her." Abigail looked at her hands. "I'm learning." "You have learned." Ruth set the letter back on the counter. "There's a difference." She rode back to the ranch, turning that over in her mind. The difference between in progress and accomplished, between the thing you are working toward and the thing you have, without realizing it, already arrived at. She thought about the Thursday she'd sat at that kitchen table with Gerald's first letter, and Silas had come in and read it and pulled out the chair across from her and said, simply, "What do you want to do?" She thought about how foreign the question had sounded, how long it had taken her to understand it was genuine. She thought, "I understand it now. Not as a concept, but as a fact of her daily life, as something she expected, in the way you expect what you've been given long enough." That was the change. Not that she'd gotten stronger, she'd always been strong, in the tenacious, necessary way of someone who has to be. The change was that she'd stopped expecting the support to be taken away. Clara's father did not, as it turned out, ask his daughter what she wanted. What he did was something less elegant and more human. He had 3 conversations with different people over the course of 2 weeks. One with his wife, one with the rancher he'd arranged the marriage with, and one, at the wife's insistence, with his daughter. And at the end of the 3 conversations, he told the rancher that the arrangement was postponed indefinitely. Clara appeared at the Boone Ranch on a Thursday afternoon to report this, and her face had the particular quality of a person who has gotten something they needed but hadn't gotten it cleanly, with none of the drama resolved, just the immediate danger moved back. "He didn't ask what I wanted," Clara said. They were on the porch, the 2 of them, the afternoon going cool. "He told my mother he wasn't going to force the issue right now. That's different." "Yes," Abigail said, "it is different. It could come back. It could. It's not really fixed, is it?" Abigail looked at her. Clara was 16, and she was smarter than the people around her had given her credit for, and she was sitting with the complicated reality that a problem setback was not a problem solved. "No," Abigail said, "it's not fixed. It's better. Better and fixed aren't the same thing." She looked at the ridge in the distance. "Some situations don't get fixed. They get managed. You make better today, and then you make better the next day, and eventually the accumulation of better days becomes a different life than the one you are going to have." She paused. "What do you want? Not from this, from your life. What do you actually want?" Clara was quiet. It was the kind of question, Abigail knew, that some people had never been asked and so had never developed an answer to. The answer needed time to surface. "I want to do accounts," Clara said finally. "Numbers. I'm good at it. My father's books are a mess and I've been fixing them since I was 12 and he doesn't know." She looked at her hands. "I want to do that for something real." Abigail thought about the ledger on her kitchen table. She thought about the Ridgeline feed supplier and the quarterly order and the 15% overpayment she'd found in the 3rd week. She thought about the back section of the ledger, now thick with notes on Mercer's pattern, that had helped Voss build the case for the inquiry. "I know an attorney in Ridgeline," she said. "He's 60 and meticulous, and his office filing system is an insult to the concept of organization. I've seen it. I have strong feelings about it." She looked at Clara. "I can't promise anything, but if you're interested, I can introduce you." Clara stared at her. "You do that. I'd make an introduction. What you do with it is yours." She said the last word with deliberate weight because it was the weight that mattered. Clara went home an hour later, and Abigail stood on the porch watching her ride toward the road, and she thought about the things you give people that cost you nothing but change the shape of their possibilities. A letter of introduction, a question asked genuinely. A room with a door that locks, the difference between you can leave whenever you want and the life that follows when you believe it. She'd been the recipient of those things in the last year more than she could easily count. She was discovering that receiving them had somehow made her more capable of giving them, not less, as if generosity was not a finite resource that depleted with use but something that grew from exercise, the way muscle does. Voss sent a final letter in late September. She read it at the kitchen table on a morning when the first cold of the coming season was in the air and Silas was outside with Roy working the north pasture fence, the one they'd finally gotten the right lumber for. She could hear them from the open window, the occasional sound of hammering, Roy's grunt of approval when something went in right, Silas's low voice saying something she couldn't make out. The letter said that Gerald Harper had, as Voss had predicted, made one final attempt, a motion through the Ohio court arguing that Abigail's marriage outside the state constituted grounds to revisit the property arrangement. It was the kind of legal argument that sounded possible until someone who knew what they were doing looked at it directly. Voss had looked at it directly. The motion had been denied. The farm was hers, without qualifier, without remaining challenge, without any mechanism Gerald could reach for that hadn't already been anticipated and countered. Voss's final line read, "I believe that this matter is concluded. It has been, if I may say so, a privilege to work on something that mattered." She folded the letter and held it in both hands for a moment. Then she got up and went outside. Silas was at the north fence, his back to her, working a post with the focused physical efficiency she'd cataloged long ago as one of his primary modes. The way his body understood work moved inside it without self-consciousness. Roy was 20 feet down the line, doing the same. The morning was cold and bright, and the grass was the last green it would be for a while. She walked up beside Silas and waited for him to finish the post he was resetting. He looked at her. He read her face. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked out at the fence line and at the valley and at the sky, which was doing its enormous impassive Wyoming thing, and she watched him absorb it, the finality, the clean edge of something genuinely finished. "Roy," he said, without raising his voice much. Roy looked over. "That's enough for the morning." Roy looked at the fence, looked at Silas, looked at Abigail in a way that suggested Roy understood most things and simply preferred not to comment on them. He picked up his tools and walked toward the barn. She and Silas stood at the fence and didn't say anything for a while. The hawk was back, or a different hawk. It was impossible to know, working the thermal above the east ridge. "The farm is mine," she said. "Finished. No more Gerald. No more Gerald. And the inquiry is moving. Mercer is going to have to disclose or fight the disclosure, and either way, the record exists. And Aldous and the others have the inquiry protecting them from the New Deal terms. For now, until it resolves." She looked at the fence. "This is better than I thought it would be, 8 months ago." 8 months ago, you had 42 cents, he said. She turned to look at him. "You know about the 42 cents? You told me, the night we came back from the spring social." He looked at her. "You were telling me how the whole thing started, and you mentioned the 42 cents and the corn muffin from the postmistress." She had no memory of this. She'd told him so much, in so many conversations, at the kitchen table, on the wagon, in the ordinary space of evenings, that she'd lost track of what she'd told him versus what she'd simply carried. The fact that he'd held on to it, that specific detail, that specific number, landed somewhere in her chest and stayed there in the way that things landed with Silas, which was quietly, without announcement, and with complete intention. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I wrote the letter. The first one, my response to yours, 4 times. He was looking at the fence. "I told you I wrote it 3 times. That was wrong. It was 4. The 3rd time I got to the end, and I thought it was the one I'd send, and I sat with it overnight, and in the morning I looked at it, and I thought," he paused, "I thought, this still sounds like a man trying not to need anything, and that's not honest, so I wrote it again." She looked at his profile, the jaw, the lines, the pale gray eyes that were doing their work of seeing things as they were. "The 4th one was the one I sent," he said. I know, she said. I could tell. He looked at her. The paragraph, she said, about not knowing what kind of arrangement it would be, about the next train home if it wasn't right. She looked at the valley below them. That was a man who'd stopped trying not to need anything. That's why I wrote back. He was quiet for a moment, a long moment, the kind he took when something was real. I almost burned it, he said. The fourth one. I stood at the stove with it in my hand for about 10 minutes. What stopped you? He looked out at the ridge. I thought, if I burn it, I already know what the next 20 years look like, and I'd rather not know. She held that. She thought about the post office bench and the folded advertisement and the 42 cents. She thought about all the moments in the last year that had required her to choose forward over back. Not once, grandly, but repeatedly, in small increments, each one costing something. I didn't know, she said, what I was going to find when I came here. I know. I thought I was looking for somewhere to land, somewhere that wouldn't turn into another Gerald. She looked at her hands. I didn't know I was going to find someone to actually be with. I didn't know that was still possible for me. I'd done such a good job of deciding I didn't need it. Silas turned to look at her. She looked back. You're terrible at not needing things, he said. I say that with respect, she laughed. A real one, the kind that surprised her, and she watched something happen in his face at the sound of it. Something that loosened, that had been held at a specific tension for a long time and was choosing to release. I love you, she said. She said it the way she'd found she said important things now. Not bracing, not held back, waiting for the cost, just directly, because she'd spent enough of her life managing the distance between what she meant and what she said. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. She blinked. I've known for a while, he said. I wasn't sure you knew. He reached out and took her hand, which was cold from the morning air, and held it in both of his the way he'd held everything in his life that needed holding, carefully, with attention, without performing it. I love you. I have since approximately the night you sat across from me at that table and told me you wanted to fight Gerald instead of pay him. That was only our second month, she said. I know. That's very fast. For some people, he said. For me, it felt slow. He stopped. I'd been waiting for a long time to want to say something like that to someone, and when I wanted to, I recognized it. She looked at their hands. His were larger, rougher, marked by years of the work he'd chosen. Hers were smaller, marked by the same months of the same kind of work, and by the years before that of a different kind of surviving. Together they were a pair of hands that had repaired fence and compiled evidence and turned a coffee cup in slow circles and pressed flat against a table when things were hard. Not beautiful in any particular way. Real. She thought about what it had taken to get to this specific fence post on this specific morning. Not the dramatic version of it, not the legal battles and the confrontations, though those were real, but the daily version. Every morning she'd gotten up when it was easier not to. Every conversation she'd had, honestly, when it would have been simpler to manage the edges. Every time she'd chosen to put down the 42-cent self-sufficiency and let someone stand beside her. It hadn't been a transformation. It had been an accumulation. The same way the ledger worked. Not any single entry, but the record built from all of them. She was 19 years old. She'd been married for a year. She owned a farm in Ohio and a share in a Wyoming ranch and a portion of a legal inquiry that was reshaping the water rights of an entire valley. She had an attorney who wrote letters about privilege and a milliner who made introductions and a taciturn hired hand who showed up when things went wrong and a 16-year-old girl who wanted to do accounts and might, if the introduction worked, get the chance. She had a husband who stood at the stove for 10 minutes and didn't burn the letter. Silas, she said. Yeah, we should finish the fence. He looked at her. Right now? The post at the end still needs replacing. We said we'd do it today. He looked down the line. He looked back at her. He was holding her hand still, and she wasn't trying to get it back. All right, he said. They went to finish the fence. The inquiry into ridgeline grazing and pasture associates concluded 3 months later in December on a day when the first serious snow of the season was coming down hard enough to keep everyone indoors. Voss's letter arrived in the second week of January when the weather had broken enough for the post to get through, and by then, Abigail had been expecting it long enough that the arriving felt almost quiet. The trust instrument had been required to disclose its controlling interest. Calvin Mercer's name had appeared, finally, in a public record. The water access agreements with Aldous Crane, Hector Pyle, and Dora Sims had been found to contain material misrepresentations regarding the contracting parties' identity and interests and were voided. The 2 additional ranchers whose names Abigail hadn't recognized were in the same position. Mercer had not been charged with any crime. The Territorial Land Office did not have grounds for criminal prosecution. What he'd done had been too carefully structured for that. But the agreements were gone, and the pattern was documented, and his name was now attached in a formal public record to a coordinated acquisition strategy he'd spent 4 years making sure didn't exist on paper. It was not, Voss wrote, complete justice. It was the kind of outcome that the law produced in cases like this, partial, imperfect, leaving the man at the center of it functional and free but diminished and watched. Mercer still owned the land he'd accumulated. He still had resources and patience. But the creek remained where it was, and the agreements that would have given him his trigger were void, and the Valley ranchers who'd spent 18 months isolated in their individual situations now knew each other's names and had stood in a room together looking at the same information. You have built something that will outlast this specific dispute, Voss wrote. That is rarer than winning. She read the letter twice. She put it in the drawer where she kept the important things. Her mother's will in its oilcloth sleeve, Pete Garner's letter, the first correspondence from Silas, his square handwriting, and the crossed-out word at the top. Gerald's letters she had moved to a different place, a box on the shelf, because keeping them in the same drawer had started to feel wrong. Evidence and history were different things. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the snow-covered yard and the barn and the fence line visible through the white, and she thought about what it meant to be finished with something. Not triumphant. She'd learned that real endings weren't triumphant, they were just true. They had a different weight than the carrying. Lighter in some ways, in others simply different. The way your body feels after a long job is done. Tired and intact and aware of itself in new places. She thought about her mother planting apple trees in Ohio soil, choosing each location, knowing the trees would outlast her. She thought about the patience required to plant something you might not see bear fruit. She thought about all the things her mother had quietly built and left behind. Not in grand gestures, but in daily choices, in the kind of person she raised, in a will properly executed and kept in a Bible. She thought about herself at 9 years old, watching her parents lower into Ohio ground and understanding, in the unformed way of a child, that from now on she would be managing something alone. She had been managing something alone for 9 years, and then she had not been. And the not being alone hadn't come in a rush or a revelation. It had come the way most real things came, incrementally, through the accumulation of ordinary mornings when she'd gotten up and chosen to stay and the person across the table had done the same. That was the thing she understood now that she hadn't understood on the post office bench in February with 42 cents and an advertisement folded into thirds. She'd thought she was looking for safety, which was what you looked for when you'd never had enough of it. Safety was real and it mattered, and she didn't want to dismiss it. But what she'd found was larger than safety. What she'd found was a life that was hers, not assigned, not arranged by someone else's need, not survived, but chosen specifically, daily, by 2 people who kept choosing it. She heard Silas's boots on the porch. She heard the stamp of snow off his feet. The door opened and cold air came in with him, and he closed the door and stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. "Letter from Voss," she said. He came to the table and she handed it to him, and he read it. She watched his face. He read slower than she did, always had, but he read thoroughly, the same way he did everything. When he finished, he set it down and was quiet. "Aldous' agreements are void," she said. "I see that. Mercer's name is in the record. I see that too." She looked at him. I was looking at the letter with an expression she'd gotten good at reading. Not the closed-down, assessing look, not the careful anger. Something quieter, something that had to do with the particular quality of a thing long worked for being finally real. "Ruth will want to know," he said. "I'll go tomorrow if the road's clear." He nodded. He picked up the letter and folded it and handed it back to her, and she put it in the drawer with the things that mattered. "The east pasture fence held through the first snow," he said. She looked at him. "I checked this morning. The new post we put in held fine." He looked at the window. "Figured you'd want to know." She stood there, looking at this man. This imperfect, careful, patient, letter-burning, coffee cup-turning, shows-up-when-it matters man. And she thought about all the ways she'd almost not been here, all the moments where the calculation had been close and could have gone differently. She thought, "I am glad I did not burn my letter either. Come sit down," she said. He sat. She sat across from him. The snow outside was coming down in the quiet, persistent way that Wyoming snow came. Not dramatic, not in a hurry, just committed to the accumulation of itself. "What do you want to do this winter?" she asked. "Once the work is managed, what do you actually want?" He thought about it. She loved that he thought about things. She loved that he didn't answer before he'd had a chance to mean the answer. "I want to read in the evenings," he said. "I stopped doing that a long time ago. I stopped doing a lot of things." He looked at her. "And I want to hear you hum while you work. You started doing that about 2 months ago. I don't think you know you're doing it." She didn't know she was doing it. She sat with that for a moment. The idea that happiness had arrived the way it apparently did, without announcement, expressing itself through the body before the mind caught up. "I want to write to Pete Garner," she said. "He's been managing the farm in Ohio for a year and a half, and I've sent money, but I haven't written a real letter. He deserves a real letter." She looked at the table. "And I want to go back someday, not to stay, but to see the apple trees, my mother's trees." "We'll go," Silas said, "in the spring if the ranch can spare us for 2 weeks." She looked at him. Just like that. Just like that. He spread his hands on the table. "It's your farm, Abigail. It's your mother's trees. We should see them." She held the simplicity of that. The way he said, "we," the way it included without absorbing, the way he understood that the farm in Ohio was hers specifically and went with it rather than around it. She thought about what Ruth had said. "You have learned, not you are learning." The difference between the ongoing and the accomplished. She was not finished learning. She was not finished making mistakes or misjudging things or carrying too much alone before she remembered she didn't have to. She was not finished being afraid of some things or over-preparing for others. She was 18 years old, 19 now, as of 2 weeks ago, though they'd marked the occasion quietly with a cake Silas had made that was structurally ambitious and culinarily imperfect, which she'd found more touching than something done well would have been. She was not finished in any direction. But she was not the girl on the post office bench either, managing the distance between herself and the world, braced for the next reduction. She was Abigail Boone. She had a ledger and a lawyer and a community and a farm in Ohio and a ranch in Wyoming with a creek on it that no one was going to take. She had a husband who meant what he said and showed up and turned his coffee cup in circles when he was sitting with something real. She had chosen this life, and it had chosen her back, and the choosing, she understood now, was not an event. It was a practice. It was the thing you did every morning, in the small decisions, in the conversations you had honestly, and the ones you showed up for even when they were hard. It was the accumulation of ordinary faithfulness to the things and people you'd decided were worth it. That was what love was, she thought. Not the moment of it, not the declaration, though both of those were real. It was the daily practice of it. The fence you fixed together. The letter you didn't burn, the inquiry you built from 3 conversations and a ledger, the cake that was imperfect, the hand held in the cold morning air without being asked. Outside, the snow kept coming down, steady and without drama, covering the yard and the fence and the slope of the east pasture, making the world clean and quiet and waiting for whatever came next. She looked at the man across the table. He was looking back at her. "Ready?" she said. He knew what she was asking. She could tell because he answered without needing to clarify. "Been ready," he said, "for a while now." She nodded. She got up and put the kettle on for the evening, and outside the Wyoming winter settled in around the ranch like something that had decided to stay. And inside the kitchen, the lamp made its warm, imperfect circle of light, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.